Gregg Hurwitz, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you.
My first question for you is, if you were to look at the West right now as a character in a story arc, what stage are we at? Is this a tragic unraveling, a fall, or a moment just before a phoenix-like rebirth?
Well, I think that's largely up to us.
Mm.
If we want to wake up, if we want to understand aspects of our willful blindness, if we want to take a look in the mirror at the forces that are massing over our shoulders from our particular partisan or ideological proclivities, then I think we have a shot at righting the ship. It's not overwhelmingly complicated, in fact, but we have a real rigidity in viewing all problems as accruing to the opposition ideologically. And we've deteriorated into real black and white thinking in a way that is insufficient. You're talking a lot about the post World War II narrative that's falling apart. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. But one of them is that the people who have lived that, the last members of the greatest generation, the last Holocaust survivors, are all dying right now. We've lived in this post World War II idyll in some ways in the West, where we've had a story that we've lived by, and we have felt like we're not really in capital H history, that the same rules that have always governed the historical record don't apply to us, that we're entitled to a certain kind of safety or lack of exploration of troubling issues or complications. And I don't think we have been excellent stewards of that story and of that narrative. And if we want to keep pointing fingers and viewing this as something that is, completely binary, that all the fault is the fault of the left or all the fault is the fault of the right, we're not actually stepping back and seeing what's happening in a deeper mythological sense.
Do you think that there is any forces at play that seeks to reframe the entire conversation as a left versus right battle within the West? Or is this a sort of natural progression of just bipartisan or partisan politics? Do you think there's anything stoking the flames of that divide?
I think there's an enormous amount. I think both things are true at once. So I think there's a natural cycle in a story where stories flip upside down. And we can see this everywhere, where the villain becomes the hero, let's say. We saw this with, in Wicked as a reexamination of that. We saw this when I was writing for DC Comics. One of my jobs when they relaunched the whole DC world of comics, they called it the New 52, because basically the canon had gotten so overwrought that unless you were a habitual collector of comics and a 50-year-old man, you couldn't keep up with it. And part of when they did that was I reinvented some of the villains. I reinvented the Penguin, for instance, who's now had a TV show and a movie, and I reinvented Clayface and Scarecrow. We're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing this with Disney, right, where we have Maleficent. So there's a stage where the stories, if they get too rote or if they get too comfortable, you start to see an inversion. And we saw this too with the John Gardner novel Grendel. I don't know if you remember that. That was Beowulf from the perspective of Grendel. There's a trend to start to play with ideas by taking their opposite. So there's a natural arc and ways that stories fulfill a life cycle and flip on their heads. Now that's hastened by three primary aspects of the culture right now. One of them is bad faith domestic players who profit by making us think that we disagree on everything and that there's someone to blame for everything that exists in our life. The other is hostile foreign regimes, and we see a huge amount of involvement from Russia, China, and Iran, primarily, or the Islamic Republic, I should say, who are feeding these narratives. And every time we manage to tamp one down or identify or get a handle on one, another one flares up. There's a lot of this behind immigration narrative. There's a lot of this behind Jew hate. If you get a handle on some of the stuff, at one point there was a particular explosion of, anti-Semitism and got a handle on that. And the next thing that surged to the fore was self-harm in young women. It's anything that will damage us as a people, that will damage our ability to be healthy, to thrive, to reproduce, to flourish, and to get along with each other. And the third aspect is psychopathic algorithms. And those are what predominantly drive eyeballs and clicks. If you are online and feeling anything, someone's making money. And that's monetized. And to have our differences monetized, blame, outrage, fear, anxiety, terror, rage, revenge, racism, over-sexualized content. These are all the things that are perversely affecting, that seek to lock us in, sort of an attempt to hijack our nervous systems for profit. And so we're up against it. Anytime that we're online, there's There are so many different sensors that are being used by our cameras. These cameras we're talking through right now, the cameras that are in here when we go on Twitter or Instagram, they're looking at our eyeball dilation. They're seeing if you're scrolling where your thumb has a quarter-second snag because some content has caught your eye. So they're feeding a lot of this stuff. And so one of the things that I was very interested in with this was to determine, are you familiar with the term pluralistic ignorance that's used in mind control cults? Does that ring a bell?
It rings a little bit, but just for the sake of the audience.
So basically it's where everyone's miserable, but they can't talk to each other. So you see this all the time when you're in a cult setting. I went undercover into mind control cults to research one of my novels. I was very interested in the methods of persuasion. And so in a cult, everyone might have their own doubts or their own fears. But what happens is there's a couple things. One is privacy deprivation. They never let somebody be alone long enough to be with their thoughts. They seek to limit or cut off access to outside information. And they seek to have a structure by which you can't really state your opinion because it'll be frowned upon so intensely and you'll be shamed into sort of submission into what's happening with the norm. So everybody is separately miserable, but they can't talk to each other. So think of that as like all of North Korea, let's say. And so we've replicated that in a certain way with our technology. Our phones mean that we have basically privacy deprivation. I mean, I see all the time you go to the bathroom, there's guys standing at a urinal and they're on their phones still. These things are with us everywhere that we go. They seek to limit our access to people who don't think like us. We unfriend people. We silo people. And as for speaking our mind, one of the things that happens is we're afraid to say the things that we might really feel that are reasonable positions because we're worried that it will be inflicted upon us massive reputational and financial damage. And so everybody's in this sort of cowed state of suspended terror due to mind control, with a lot of bad faith players and algorithms are feeding that bucket. And it's leading us to believe we're way more polarized than we are. I mean, if you look at the media, I mean, the belief of the number of people who have alternate views of the opposing side, the things that Democrats think of Republicans, are massively skewed, and vice versa. And so one of my points of interest with this is I wanted to do a lot of research to determine where in fact we are. And a problem with polling is, as with science, is there's a lot of push polling, right? So if you phrase questions in a certain way, you get the desired result. And a lot of the vendors and people who are pollsters in the partisan classes get paid, and their livelihood depends on producing poll results that then can be the impetus to drive more contracts, which is moving in lockstep ideologically. So I wanted to set about to try some polling where I wrote the questions not like a partisan jerk, basically. So if I were to poll a question, for instance, that says, I believe in climate change, maybe you get 55% of people will agree with that. If I say, I believe climate change is a hoax, maybe you get 45%. So instead, I phrased the question differently, where I just said, I believe that we should have clean fields and streams and skies and seas. Like, it's all of our responsibility to take care of the world around us. I got 94% agreement on that. So if you want to actually look at where we're unified and not augment that, so 94% is a great place to start. And then you can have discussions of, well, what's the best approach? Is it ocean biodiversity? Is it carbon imprint, right? There's all sorts of ways you can have debates around that then if you're building from what's common. But if instead you can figure out that 6% and phrase a question and get that 6% to 60% outrage, all of a sudden you have and you can feed the hate industrial complex, the fundraising drives for politicians, and the ideological monster that's before us. And so we basically went through and did this polling on every major issue, whether it's abortion, whether it's immigration, whether it's transgender stuff, whether it's topic after topic after topic. If you phrase it in a way, we find that 80 to 100% of Americans agree on virtually everything. And yet we feel like we've never been more polarized. And there's a real risk now, because the more that is the perception, the more that perception can become the reality. And there's also ways that they're playing with this. For instance, Russia sent agents to France to paint Stars of David on the synagogues and the houses of Jews, so that everywhere that people looked, it seemed like there was anti-Semitism, and that creates an authorizing environment for more anti-Semitism. So our skews can remake the reality around us.
Mm-hmm. It's really fascinating when you mention even just talking about it can add to the framing of division. So even in the sense of talking about this, even in terms of talking about the West and what it's going through, further almost concretizes the narrative that we are so divided. And that's one of the issues when I guess talking about this. And when you describe the fact that so much of America agrees on so much, that doesn't seem to line up with the experiences of people who spend so much time online. It does seem like that we are so fractured and so almost like a Tower of Babel like situation where we're just not understanding each other. We're just totally existing in separate paradigms, and we've just lost the language to be able to communicate with each other. So that's the first point. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. And secondly, is there any evidence that there are actually not just the theory that there are malicious actors from foreign countries who are stoking the flames of this, but is there any actual evidence that proves it? Any data, any whistleblowers, either from back in the day with KGB or anyone from the Islamic regime? Like, how do we know that this is actually happening as opposed to a theory that's what's happening?
So we've tracked that. So there are two different questions, both of which are important. Let me start with the first part, and then or the second thing that you're asking, and then let's back up to the first about the Tower of Babel effect. That's really interesting as well to talk about this and the disillusion of our post-World War II narrative.
Yep.
But so, for instance, when we were doing some polling, I did a lot of information and the polling that I do and the interventions in the culture that I do with the core team of people I have around me who are amazing. We are actually curious to ascertain what is happening. We're not trying to fill some designated notion so we can fundraise more. So we're always exploratory, and we're not afraid to rush to failure. And a large part of this is none of us are really doing this as professional vendors. So we can keep a more clear incentive structure when we have a more purely curious engagement to figure out what works and doesn't. It doesn't mean we don't have our value sets or the things that we're trying to fix in the culture, like extremism, or we're trying to move towards unity. But so one of the things that we found that was a stunning result was that women between the ages of 18 and 34 have a 54-point higher dislike, disregard, hatred of America, Jews, and Israel. So that's a stunning finding. And women 18 to 34 are one of the key drivers of, opinion for a bunch of reasons. They are the spenders, right? There a lot of marketing can target that. Men tend to move towards women in that age range in terms of attraction and try and mirror things that will make them palatable to women who feel that way. So they're a very key demographic to be focused on. So, what did we determine? Because we were started to then look and break down where women in that demographic get their news sources. And we found that 2 standard deviations above the norm of other groups, they get their news primarily from TikTok. And so there's a lot of information that's being fed through China with this. And we know that China with TikTok, they import, there's a limit on how much time that their own kids can use at home. It's all educational. They're being taught mathematics, different things. The cuts are in fact even longer. And they're all educational, and they're limited. I believe it's 40 minutes a day. Whereas, so they're sort of like using TikTok as broccoli to strengthen their own people, and then they're exporting crack. It's the most divisive stuff. And so you're going to get something that's like a super sexy woman, and then you get a squirrel on a skateboard, and then you get why America sucks, and then you get Jew hate, and then you get a sexual thing. It's this flurry, and they keep cutting down the time that the TikToks are to sort of shred attention span and drive people. It's a way to cut and add to ADHD among our kids. And so there's full-blown differences in what's allowed internally and externally. So a lot of the evidence is there. The other thing I was very interested in is you mentioned the Tower of Babel effect. So, I've been talking to a lot of symbolic and religious thinkers and theologians about some of what we're up against here, including a couple seminars that Jordan Peterson led on the Daily Wire with Jonathan Pajot and Douglas Headley and Stephen Blackwood and Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager for some of these. And one of the things that's very interesting that's pointed out, and Pajot, Jonathan Pajot is a wonderful symbolic thinker, brilliant, and Jordan, I think most of your followers are familiar with Jordan Peterson. So we've been having a lot of conversations about how we track patterns that stories can tell us in the ways that people behave. They can be predictive in a certain way. And we tend to get hung up on like, well, what are all the facts and what's all the data? But a lot of times these stories hold deeper meaning. And so if you think about one of the things that's been a predominant value of the West that we've seen a lot is grievance culture, right? So grievance culture in a lot of ways is embedded in the story of Cain and Abel, right? It's the third story in the Bible. And, Abel walks with God and he makes the proper sacrifices, and Cain makes not good sacrifices. And so Cain, rather than learning and making the proper sacrifices, chooses instead to kill Abel. And one of the things that Jordan has said is when you kill the thing that you should aspire to, you're killing the future, because you're losing your North Star. You're losing the thing you should strive to. It's not just the act. And that's why Cain is cursed generationally. So one of his offspring from his line is Tubal-Cain, who's the father of tools. And the father of tools, you can think of like a father of engineers. And that's the line that goes on and builds all the cities. And from the cities and from this lineage, that is where the Tower of Babel is built. So the Tower of Babel is a tool that's built by the father of engineers, that's supposed to be a structure that reaches the heavens, but is, equal to and equivalent to God, but separate from that overarching value set and narrative. So what happens on the way to us trying to construct this, if we're being led by blind, engineering, the fact that we have tools and we want to use them, is on our way towards constructing something that's equivalent to things that are God or godlike.
Exactly.
Like AI, everybody starts to speak different languages. Well, that's precisely what's happening with cell phones. The more that we are trying to set up these structures that are separate from a subsidiary value set that we have, we need technology. I'm not arguing that we should be Luddites, but it has to be nested in a way. When we're dealing with AI, we want to be Sorcerer Mickey from Fantasia. We don't want to be the eyeless mops hauling buckets of water around. And so if we don't have it in a proper place, and at the top should be truth, right? Or love, or self-sacrifice for the long-term strategic betterment of the community. There's all these other values that are there, but when they're devoid, we sort of move forward blindly. And I think we've had an erosion of a shared story and shared value sets that are based on our foundational texts and values, whether that's, the Greco-Roman tradition, whether that's Old Testament, New Testament. But we have foundational mythologies that have granted us a lot of the freedoms and ways that we view the world that are foundational. By that, I don't mean to imply also that they should be put entirely in charge and replace the American Constitution. But I mean, the more that we eschew anything and keep having more and more hedonistic individualism, where the human and the way that the human defines himself is the center of everything, the more we're losing a grip on what is a shared story. And there's specific ways that's happening within the World War II narrative.
Well, let's spend a little bit more time on the connections between the biblical narratives. And I think Jonathan Pageau has done a phenomenal amount to help bridge the gap for secular minds to understand the patterns of those stories. And so he's coming on later in the month to talk about a lot of this stuff. But while I've got you talking about the Tower of Babel and some of those similarities here, the symbolism really is striking. And so even when you mentioned that the majority of, I think you said there was something to do with young females and their propensity to have a lot of hate and angst or rebellion against whatever it be, the structures of existence, let's say the West or America or whatever that may be. I can't help but go back straight back to Eden and Genesis and this symbolism there between this taking of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which you could translate to being sort of like the possession of morality, the knowledge of good and bad, good and evil, and how that temptation from the serpent led to the fall. But actually today what we've got is the same thing happening with this sort of hyper-moralization. And we think that the route to salvation in a utopia society is more moral policing. And something about that is relating to what's going on with our outrage culture on social media, wanting to act like we are the moral arbiters, wanting to cancel people that don't meet the right criteria of political correctness, or show too many microaggressions or unconscious bias and those kinds of things, and putting us almost in place of God. Is there anything there for you which rings true to the kind of hypermoralization and the story of Eve and the fall?
There's a great deal. I think there's two primary battles I think that we're fighting. I don't think they're between left and right, and I don't think they're between red and blue or Democrats or Republicans. I think the first is it's psychopaths on the far left and the far right versus everybody else. And due to these technologies, they have outsized effect. The other thing is we are losing an ability to translate between people who think secularly and people who think symbolically. I think that there's groups in this country and in the West who think completely differently, and they're not even aware in a lot of regards, in a lot of ways, of what the basis is of their thinking. And so, you mentioned the Garden of Eden. In a lot of ways, the first part of the Bible is, God separates light from dark and the land from the sea and the sky from, right? He's separating everything. In a way, it says things are binary. That's one of the lessons, right? And of course, there's things that don't fit, and there's marginalia in texts, and there's fringe. There's all sorts of things and allowances that are made, but it's a primary message. And so I think that when the left is talking about that and pushing I'm talking about the far left now, that everything is non-binary, it has a triggering effect that people aren't even really sure where they are.
Yep.
Right. So then the second story is, when Adam, we have Adam and Eve, and then Adam names the animals. And Jonathan has talked about, Pajot has talked about how in a lot of the tradition, the animals come and kneel before Adam, and Adam naming them is a sort of stewardship or ownership over them. Right. So it means that nature comes and man is placed sort of above, responsibly above nature. And a lot of that has been inverted. If you invert that, it's a return to paganism. And you see a lot in the far left green narrative, which you're as much an expert in as anybody. There's this inversion where nature or the environment is more important than people. And Douglas Murray said this quite brilliantly at one point. He said, look, people, we're not the problem, we're the point. And so if your solutions for how we're going to contend with change and dance and mastery of the environment as we move into the future involves putting humans on a lower rung, that's just a return to paganism. That's like mommy mother nature's mad at us and now we'll be punished. So let's not have kids and let's not use energy and let's, police, people are going to die because they're not going to have enough energy in the heat and in the cold. And it's a reversion. Yep. And so people, I don't think, are aware of this. There's these subconscious ways that the world is moving in different directions, and they're losing that unification. And I think that there's a parting out of this. And, Jonathan and Jordan and I are in a kind of ongoing discussion about this, about why this is happening in the post-World War II narrative. And I think that one way to think about this is that there is a sort of glitch that's nestled in our post-World War II victorious narrative that we've been living in. And one of those glitches that's sort of swept under the rug is that to defeat Hitler, we had to partner with one of the biggest psychopaths in the history of the world, that's in Stalin. And so when we moved to victory, when we finished, we carved up half of Europe and handed it over to him, to difficult effect for a lot of those people, into a value system that was brutal and murderous. I mean, more people have died from fascists and fascistic leaders from the right than from the left. If you take Pol Pot, if you take Mao Zedong, if you take Stalin. Now, there has been some backlash. So what I'm suggesting isn't a super clean version of the story, but I'm talking about an overall trend. We certainly had backlash against communism. We had the McCarthy era here. It hasn't been one way, but there has been something of a free pass that has been given to philosophies and theories of the left and the far left, like communism and socialism and Marxism. And there's ways that Marxism, after the abject failure that it saw in Russia and in China under Mao Zedong, got warmed over through the Frankfurt School or through the French deconstructionists who brought it in through English departments. I remember when I was at college in the 90s, I studied English and psychology, and there was all this theory. We were reading so much Foucault and Derrida, and it's such a weird entry point for Marxism until you realize, if you're going to redo this and you're going to take capitalist and worker, and that clearly doesn't work, so you're going to reframe it as oppressor and victim, or colonialist and victim. The best way to do that, the best way to get your teeth into a culture is to attack the story. And that's why you have all these French deconstructionists coming in through English departments. So when you're reading Shakespeare, all of a sudden, you're not reading timeless stories or the Iliad, timeless, about courage and strength and betrayal. But what you're looking at is a limited view from one person who's a colonialist, who has his experiences, who has centered his story. And you start to eat at the bottoms of all these things. And that's the same way that you can start to get rid of colonialist literature. If you don't read Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and George Orwell, well, you're a lot less prepared. So there's been a lot of inroads that have been made from socialism, communism, Marxism, to just wrap them all together in ways that are disconcerting. There's some departments, like sociology departments in America, some of them are as high as 25% of the professors are identified Marxists. Wow. And we have to pause for a minute to think about how crazy that is. And there's student groups all the time who support, whether it's Marxism or communism. You never would see a fascist identified professor on a U.S. college campus, let alone, 10, 15, 25% of them in different departments. You'd never have student groups saying, well, we're a Nazi student group, we just don't think Hitler got Nazism right. But if it's actually done properly, and so on the one hand, we've had a lot of allowances that are made for these ideologies that are brutal. And on the other hand, Jonathan talks about this quite beautifully, but and this ties into how we take care of a story. But so with Hitler, Hitler's played the role of Satan on Earth since World War II. Like, it's worse to be called Hitler than Satan, probably in the mainstream culture, and for good reason. I mean, certainly as a Hurwitz, you're not going to find me advocating for Hitler's policy in ways that's positive. But he was a human. He's a human being, and everything that he touched, we've sort of taken and wrapped around him, and we've sunk to the bottom of the ocean into hell with him, and we've not allowed any budging on it. And so there's certain things that we've never rethought or regoverned properly in our post-World War II narrative, the same way that we never fully came to grips with the fact that we partnered with Stalin and gave him half of Europe and we're allowing these inroads. By the same token, one of the things that Hitler touched in its most awful incarnation is nationalism. Well, we do need some version of patriotism, and you can't just afford a national identity to certain countries. You can't just say, okay, well, Senegal and Costa Rica and Israel and, Saudi Arabia can be proud for what the country they are, but you can't if you're Ireland or England or America or Australia. It's not a tenable way to view this. And another thing certainly is pride in one's tribe, which again, Hitler took to horrific extremes. But you can't have one group of people and determine, or different groups of people, and say, well, you can be very proud of your heritage if you're black or you're Jewish or you're like fill in the blank, right? If you're Mexican, if you're from all these different countries, but you can't be proud if you're from European blood or if you're American, because we just know where that leads to. And people are grasping around for identity. And I think that part of this is there's certain ways that stories work. And if you take things, and one of the things that I think it's important for us to discuss here is how this all tangles up in free speech. Because the inroads made from either side into us through those hostile foreign regimes are generally, they come in through our greatest strengths. So with the left, it's like, diversity is a wonderful aspect of America. If you think of it like variety, if you think about the ways that we can get the best and strongest people from other countries, if we can integrate them in an American ideology with American values towards freedom, towards merit, towards hard work, wonderful. It's one of the wonderful ways, for instance, that immigrants, who come in tend to be conservative and they refeed the blood flow of America if everybody is integrated. But so they come in through, well, it's inclusion. And inclusion can't be a top value for any single structure. You can't have a school band. You can't have a physics project. You can't have soldiers. You can't have a soccer team if that's the top value. And likewise, with freedom of speech, of course we need freedom of speech. But freedom of speech, if people are starting to promulgate different ideas, and, there's different popular ones that are emerging, was Churchill really the villain of World War II and Hitler wasn't all that bad? There can be legitimate responses to that to say, well, here's the argument. Here's why I don't think that makes sense. And that's not a dampening of free speech. Free speech doesn't mean that everything gets promulgated everywhere, number one, or number two, that it can't be criticized. The whole point of free speech is that it's criticized and taken apart, and ideally taken apart by people who are knowledgeable in something. And that doesn't always mean conventionally trained experts who, as we know, can be wrong about things, but we do want to seek expertise and wisdom around different topics to differentiate them. And so if these are the kind of rallying cries that you're opposed to free speech, you're a Nazi because you're opposed to this, you're a communist because you're shutting this down, we're losing the ability to be appropriate stewards of the story that we all have to share. And one of those ways is when free speech goes wrong, for instance, is when certain ideas are never allowed to be discussed. And so that's one of the things that we've seen for a lot of years with, if you talk about, collective pride for certain cultures is just not allowed, or you get called a Nazi immediately. Well, there's nowhere to go with that. You can't make certain topics completely off limits. An example that I think of a lot, and we also have made certain things, if you repress them, if you make certain topics taboo, inadvertently what you're doing is you're making them sacred. And then people want to go grab them because you make them almost more palatable. Here I think about, do you remember when Prince Harry went to a costume party dressed as a Nazi? There's a big uproar. He was like a year or two out of Eton, and everybody freaked out, and it was never to be just, under no circumstances you ever to be a Nazi. And part of this is that's exactly when you should be dressed up as a Nazi. Yeah. That's Carnival, right? That is Halloween is you're dressing as as sometimes horrific things, whether it's a serial killer, whether it's Jason from Friday
Right.
the 13th. And when we say, no, you can't have any part
Right.
of that, that has to be shunned everywhere, in a way, we're making it hard
Right. You're
taboo.
making it
We're not
you're
allowing.
making it divine in the same way that like Muslims will be upset with the depiction of Muhammad or something.
That's
Yeah.
right. It's an inversion in a weird way of it has the opposite effect of what we want, and it can't then be inoculative. Like there's a game called Secret Hitler that's like werewolf that people play or mafia, and it was a game where everyone's at a table game and one person's in the SS and one person plays Hitler, and you all play this game and the person's trying to get you like the werewolf or like the head of the mafia, and it's up to the people to suss him out and to beat Hitler. And it's a game where you're allowed to take on a role in a sort of safe way that has an inoculative effect, and then you leave it behind and everyone goes on with their life. But when you make it off limits, I mean, my head always goes to these if you think about narrative, let's say that there's a story, it's an Indiana Jones movie that we're in right now. And let's say we want to take a couple target, like a couple of topics like anti-Semitism and like hardcore misogyny. And if we take those things and we don't let anybody discuss anything that has anything to do with them, they become these distant totems, like up in a mountain in the distance. And basically we're saying no one can ever go up there or look at them. And a lot of people are saying, well, why not? Like, why is there once a year that we'll go and we'll have a way to discuss it? Are there ways that there's discussions? Are there ceremonies that we can approach them and learn from them and have confusion around them and be taught anew? And if the answer is no, there's no version under which anything around a topic of nationalism, anti-Semitism, misogyny can ever be discussed in any way, or you're a Nazi, period. If you make those two things rigid, what's going to happen is people start to ask, well, what's the reason for that? And if your answer is, well, that's what my father told me and his father before him, that's not a sufficient answer. And you're going to have people who fancy themselves sort of adventurers or rule breakers who are going to want to just smash one taboo after another, after another, after another. And so soon you have Hitler was the hero of World War II and your body, my choice. And people are going to reach to, or what Kanye's doing, Kanye's sort of like a court jester who's playing with symbols in ways that are dangerous and in some ways making them safe and in some ways feeding the flames. And he's a jester figure in a lot of ways. And he's playing with these things to a lot of effect. And part of being a steward of a story is that you allow that, yes, like with America, freedom won and triumph won. And I think if you look at America, you can see that the arc of justice is long, but is bent towards, or the arc of history is long, but it's bent towards justice. We've seen up until recently, greater rights and dignity afforded for women. We've had, more and more acceptance with Jews into the mainstream culture. We've made all these advances in ways that are working. But we haven't allowed conversations to say, well, we should really talk about what happened with Marxism. And we should really talk about why you can't have national pride if you're some countries, but you can others. And what does that mean? And how do we give people access to this? And how do we introduce people who might have an in-group tribal view, if they're lower big five personality trait openness, for instance, they don't like other people, to afford conversations that can be bridge building or inoculative rather than just like hammering them off and shoving them into an opposing camp. So we've gotten too fragile and we've gotten too rigid.
So do you think?
And that's when his story starts to break.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's happening. I was going to ask you, do you think that this like explosion, this pressure cooker that's now exploded of anti-Semitism, has kind of had something to do with the fact that we just didn't want to talk about some of the nuances of the World War II story, and now the sort of rule breakers, the people that picture themselves as Neo in the Matrix and breaking through the narratives are almost coming at this from a perverse angle than if we just approached the story of Hitler with a sort of a healthier level of understanding rather than a sort of strict dogma. And do you think, because there's this phenomena that happens with all kinds of brutal military leaders in history, where after a few decades or centuries after they pass away, they lose the quality of the monster and they actually start becoming quite attractive, interesting characters from history. Think of Genghis Khan or Emperor Nero or Julius Caesar. We know of those names because of their great achievements, right? But we don't think about the people that they slaughtered. And do you think that we are approaching that with Hitler, even if it's through this strange kind of jester Kanye West-like approach? Do you think eventually we'll get there and have a healthier approach?
Well, I think there's always two choices. And one of them is you either integrate your shadow or it overwhelms you. We haven't been integrating the shadow. We haven't been looking at hard realities. And one of the things I've always thought about World War II, and I say this, as someone who's Jewish, is I think the overwhelmingly likelihood, if I was, in the middle of a German army, we all want to think we'd be the one Nazi who got out of line when they're executing Jews and got in line with the Jews and was executed. And unless you actually understand that you may very well not have been, and that the overwhelmingly likelihood is that you would have done your job and followed your orders, if you can't understand that, then you have no chance of that actually being the truth, that you could be one of those people. And Solzhenitsyn writes about this beautifully in the Gulag Archipelago. I mean, he writes about how, the line between good and evil runs not between states and religions, but through the heart of every human. And the more that we want to tell people, avoid any contact with the shadow or anything that's complicated. Here's the whole story. It's the received story. It's black or white. There's no way around it. And I think there's a lot of reasons that have to do with, like anti-Semitism in a lot of ways is a trigger to the world starting to kind of tear itself apart in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of reasons for that are complicated. Some of them have to do with a grievance culture, with a successful minority. Some of it has to do with the jobs that Jews have based on what roles they were pushed into historically. And along the lines of what we're discussing, and it's also it's always easy to, we've seen a movement from sort of Democrats to communists to Illuminati to Zionists. It's a moving, this sort of, let's call it a grievance explanation of unseen forces that control the world is just, it moves around a lot. It doesn't really matter. Jew hate can be right next door to hardcore anti-human, far left environmentalism, right? It can morph into different categories, and one of them is going to wear the hat at different times. But one of the things that we found when we were doing our research that was very troubling was 52% of Americans said that they didn't feel comfortable sort of discussing their opinions about Jews in Israel publicly. And that's a really bad sign, and I think that some of the tendencies of Jewish groups and Jewish orgs to say, well, we think there was from one of the primary groups, somebody was saying, if you're having flyers with anti-Semitic content, it should carry a jail sentence for X number of years. I think that's precisely is the wrong approach. And it's very hard because these are very scary forces that we're playing with. But coercion and insane sort of control over what narratives are allowed and discussions are allowed isn't really the answer. The answer is to try to have something that is inoculative in the discussion, and to let people go, look, if people are allowed to have opinions about Israel or about Netanyahu or about different things, but there's also been a capture of a lot of difficult and smart phrases. When people use the term genocide, that it's difficult to take that on as for a population that has been growing year after year after year and explosively. It's so when terms start to get captured and used, then it gets very complicated and everybody sort of snaps into opposing roles with it.
All right. Well, I wanted to get your thoughts on something because I've been trying to make sense of the phenomena of October the 7th and this just huge explosion of conspiracy theories against the Jews and all kinds of things like that. And since I've been thinking about the World War II consensus, I can't help but make the following connection, okay? So one of the great meta-narratives that held the post-World War II story together was the moral clarity that came from Jews being cast as the absolute powerless victims of unimaginable evil. And then the world vowed never again for that. But since October the 7th and the war between Israel and Gaza, it feels like something in that story has snapped. Could it be that seeing Jews not as victims, but as agents with power, with military strength, even with the capacity to kill, has short-circuited that ingrained narrative and empathy, triggering a kind of self-destruct mode of the entire or part of the World War II consensus? And could this explain the huge rise in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories and pro-Nazi content, which just seems to be everywhere now?
It's an interesting question. I think for me with Jews, it's always, you can tell when somebody's dealing with subconscious projection, when something is asked to play the role of two things at once. And we see this when anti-Semitism is emergent, where Jews are, powerless victims who are herded into cable cars without protest, but also hold the strings to the entire world at the same time. And they are, grotesquely fattened with luxury, with hook noses, and are readily identifiable in sketches, but also can pass and we're everywhere among everybody, manipulating everything. And so there's a lot of subconscious aspects that get put onto Jews in the Jewish story. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, and you know, they're complicated and they're different. I think that whenever you're playing with a predominant narrative that becomes victim oppressor, there's only two rules in that. And I think that part of why a surge in anti-Semitism presages bad things for cultures, like, you know, when cultures tend to, so one, Jews tend to work, or a portion of Jews tend to work, at least in the West, they tend to be on the side of sort of more openness for other groups. I think they feel like, you know, the more moderate that a culture is in its acceptance of multiculturalism, the more safe it's going to be. But there's a flipping point where, you know, when Jews go from that status, they're the one group that sort of is both things at once. And I think that's some part of that foundational part of that story breaking, where it's like, oh, wait, like you're the victims from the Holocaust, but you also control everything. And there's this sort of confusion. I think it's also a very logical outcome of this excessive binary grievance culture of the victim oppressor narrative, because at some point that model eats itself, as we know. I mean,
it's an Ouroboros. It's a snake eating itself.
That's right. And you see this all the time, you know, and this, you know, the left in particular is more cannibalizing when they go off course. That's why, you know, North Korea is always, you know, executing uncles with airplane artillery, and Mao Zedong killing everyone around him. And we saw that obviously with Stalin, who was, you know, constantly having purges and clearing everything out. There's this cannibalizing aspect that happens with that it's got to keep feeding on something. And so, you know, one of the groups it's first going to turn on, which leads to a lot of confusion, is going to be Jews, because Jews tend to advocate a lot for the rights of other groups, other minorities, other groups that aren't in the majority in the countries that they're in. So I also think that there's a lot of, you know, there's people are sort of primed for this in a lot of ways historically. I think there's religious reasons.
Yeah, well, the reason why I think there's something else going on that isn't just purely, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there are so many other huge conflicts or land disputes or, you know, actual genocides or actual apartheids that are so huge that the culture is just not getting its hook into in the same way. Mm-hmm. And I think from my perspective, it seems that, I guess, one analysis of the West and the foundation of the West is Jewish blood in some form, whether that be Christ's blood at the foundation of the West and what was Christendom. And then again with Auschwitz, with the blood of the Jews, which then created the new sort of post-World War II consensus. And then the idea then that Jews with any sort of military strength or power, it's so foreign to the way that we've structured our entire paradigm, our moral structure, that I actually don't think that the West knows what to do with that. I don't think we know what to do with Israel being so powerful. I think it flips it. It inverts it in a way that we're just not comfortable with, because I don't have any other explanation for the fact there are so many other land disputes, actual genocides, that we just don't care about. We only care about this one with the Jews on this tiny strip of land.
Well, you have to keep in mind that October 7th, within minutes, and in some cases predating the attacks, there was a fully blown propaganda campaign that was put in place that sources to the Islamic Republic and China and Russia. Everyone was primed for this. And in a sense, people often are. Like, this is one of the key points for priming. And there's certain things that the countries have been working on for years. And it's always important to remember, too, that the point itself isn't always the point. Meaning, you know, Russia's been playing around with vaccinations and villainizing and going on both sides of that equation all the way back when, like, Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey were talking about vaccinations. In the 70s, the KGB funded, you know, the Black Panthers and the KKK. The point of this is always internal disruption. And the more that we can kind of recognize that, the better shape that we're in, because the more we're standing around screaming about, you know, Jews and Muslims and all sorts of other things, right? Transgenderism and all these other things, the less that we're a unified front to actually compete with and lead in the world if you're a Western country. And so there was a huge campaign that swung into effect almost instantaneously that had been primed for years. And there's certain things that Americans hate. Americans hate the word genocide. And when that term was claimed, you know, there's a war and horrific things happen in the course of a war, but you don't tend to have a genocide. First of all, Israel, if they want to commit genocide, would have the means to do it, you know, in an afternoon. I mean, that's obvious, but also it's clearly not the aim when they're aiming to get, you know, 3,700 calories a day into Gaza, right? And the UN recommends for communities that are cut off 2,200. I mean, so there's certain things that just don't make sense, even if there are legitimate discussions about what the plan is going to be in Gaza, and certainly the West Bank has a lot more moral complexity, and there's a lot of questions that people can raise about Netanyahu. I'm not saying it's a sheer black and white issue, but I think on the cause of genocide, it falls down, and people don't care about the number of bombed people who died in Yemen, and people don't care about Sudan, and you can go down through these other conflicts in the world. China has imprisoned 2 million Uyghurs, like gang rape, sterilization, and murder. 2 million.
Yep.
And we don't hear a peep about it. It's not anywhere on TikTok. And people are being flooded 24/7 with images of a war zone that fits precisely in a frame that is a victim colonialist frame, where people think that Jews didn't exist in Israel before, the late 1940s, that there was no Jewish existence there. And so there's a lack of unreality that has been really focused and was primed and ready to go with this particular conflict. But if you look at go track the bombings and the number of deaths that have happened in Yemen or Sudan, and your head will explode for why this is getting...
Yeah, or Syria, or the Rwanda genocide, or anything
on
else.
And on and on.
And this, on and on and on. But, so this actually ties together. There's two questions here. I'll try and stick to one first, and we'll see if it's related to the next one. So bringing it back to this concept of the West. If the West has more to do with a set of values rather than a geographical location, and some of those values are being easily weaponized to undermine and attack the West itself, weaponizing the West's morality, words like genocide, those kinds of things, which are the kind of the axle around the wheel of World War II, was that genocide. And so to weaponize that, therefore, isn't there something ironic or almost predictable about this downturn of the West? Is in the sense that, let's say, China or Russia or Iran have been so easily able to weaponize the thing that was at our core, that there's almost something predictable about the West falling downhill as a result of weaponizing that morality. Does that make sense?
Of course. And especially when you lose your vigor and hold on values. I mean, we've gotten really lazy. Like if you look at colleges, and I don't love the incursion right now into higher education that the current administration is doing. I think it's an over-reckoning. But if you look at the moral failings of the universities, I mean, Harvard had something like 27 classes on colonialism. I mean, it's like, and so part of when October 7th happened is people were like, what do you think colonialism meant? Vibes? Op-eds? Like, this is exactly what you've been teaching us to do. And people don't understand. If globalize the intifada means, we had a young couple shot. One was a Messianic Christian and Jewish young lady. They met on a peace project for Gaza, which also shows you how out of whack this all is. We had a guy, light a bunch of people on fire in a mall yesterday. That's what globalized intifada means. And it's like there's a lack of comprehension of the value sets that we're in fact teaching. And I think we've been really fattened by our own luxury in the West.
Yeah, and but like you bring it back to some of the things you mentioned earlier when it comes to, like, we need some form of nationalism, some sense that we can protect ourselves from external forces. And taken to its extreme, you may get the Nazis, but that doesn't mean we don't need anything there. It's like we've simultaneously opened ourselves up so willingly that it just seems that this is predictable what's happening now. Like, we don't have any sense of being able to control our borders because that's now
sure.
racist.
I mean, when Trudeau says diversity is our strength, that doesn't. Yeah. What do? That doesn't mean anything. Yeah. How do you possibly hold together a community or a nation if that's what you're tacking towards? And so, I do think that's the case. But look, we also have means by which to assess these things. And when I talk about us getting lazy, I think there's a real moral failing and a moral bankruptcy in the kind of virtue signaling that has gone on in the West and in America. I mean, I saw people, affluent friends and colleagues, like, loudly proclaiming to defund the police when they have millions of dollars and live in a gated community. I mean, completely removed of the ramifications. Right. If you're living within a community, if you're working class, that community gets torn apart, your business gets torched, you're done. And we've allowed this, and we've allowed it for gain in people trying to scale a social hierarchy of a different kind. It's very, very dangerous. And so with the left, I've been writing op-eds about this going back to early days of Antifa and trying to urge, Democrats in particular to take a stand against, acts of increasing violence or the largely peaceful protests that caused $2 billion of damage in American cities. And one of the things that I kept saying is we have a template for this. We have a version of, it's almost like a foundational aspect of America is the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement was incredible in how it was and conducted itself. And two of the primary tenets of that were responsibility and accountability. And so before John Lewis and everybody went to march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they literally meditated to picture the cops who were about to beat them with sticks and truncheons. They meditated to picture them like little kids so that they wouldn't retaliate against them, like little boys. The amount of discipline and the amount of responsibility, and we've completely gone away from that. I mean, part of, when Rosa Parks took a position, when Martin Luther King's writing a letter from a Birmingham jail, he's sitting in jail, and the aim of that is, it's a tradition that's, of course, it's tied to Gandhi, it's tied to Mandela, who changed the world from a room he was in 27 years, the size of a king size mattress. And what it is I will shoulder responsibly all of the complaints that I'm making. I will take full responsibility for my digression from the law that I believe is an unjust law, and I will not ask for any rights beyond the rights that are afforded to everybody else in that culture. And the only thing that can change that law is when enough of my fellow people in the community can see my virtue and can see the crumbling of this law, this unjust law, across my unbowed shoulders, and they vote to change that law. It's the polar opposite of what we've done. It's like every protester we act like is every borderline or bipolar personality disorder protester who's in the streets, we treat as if they are John Lewis or Harvey Milk or Martin Luther King. We have a template for how you do this. It's not, I'm so mad and my existential crisis is so intense that I'm going to break all the rules because it's so bad and something must be done now. It's game theory. And we've allowed a game theory of chaos to enter in, and we haven't discussed and taught properly this ethic. And if you're not reading and teaching civil rights movement, if you're not reading and teaching Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and Orwell and Mark Twain and reading Frederick Douglass, if you're not schooled in the things that hold these things, what you have is people who want all the glory and all the meaning and all the prestige of past movements with none of the responsibilities. And you have students at Vassar asking to get class credit because they're going to go protest because they're so important in their protesting. And you have people going in the post George Floyd riots. You had these sort of tourist activists, Antifa people, going into predominantly black communities, breaking shit, setting cop cars on fire, spray painting. And there were videos of members of the community saying, do not do this. We live here. I'm a nurse in this hospital. Get out of this community. You're not going to be here tomorrow. And it's like we've been in this fugue state. It's like we want a taste of the Freedom March. We want a taste of the Civil Rights Movement, but we don't want it to cost us anything. And that laziness has led to all the categories they don't mean anything in a way, and they have to be rebuilt now, and they can't be rebuilt with slogans or more fundraising or a new tranche of politicians. They have to be built, I think, in two ways. One is through embodied change in leaders who will actually embody the things that they're advocating. And the other for me, again, going back to the Gulag Archipelago, when Solzhenitsyn said, for a totalitarian society to survive, everybody lies about everything all the time. And there's so many ways that people lie in our culture right now because they don't want to stick out their neck, or, well, I don't want to be judged this way, or I might suffer damage. And we've just allowed these encroachments on everything. And it's just, okay. Does that?
Yeah. No. There's so much there I want to grapple with, and I might have to just push myself to the fringes of what I can juggle here in terms of concepts. But let me just try and think. There was a talk you gave with Jonathan Pajot at Ralston College fairly recently, and towards the end of that, there was a great moment where Pajot talked about this idea of not necessarily controlling the narrative, but playing a role in forming early narratives that we imbibe as children, whether that be fairy tales or the stories we inherit from the biblical stories, and how when you get to that level of reality, you're shaping your own and other people's ability to then later interpret things that happen later on in their life. That may not make sense. Let me just grapple with this. So when you look at someone like Martin Luther King and many of the other civil rights activists, and you think about the Methodists, Christians in the UK who are pushing for the abolition of slavery, they were approaching this very much from a Christian heritage and a Christian paradigm when it comes to how you conduct yourself in the world. That story is now not very common amongst people, and certainly not the case within the rise of the activist generation. Okay, and the way they're conducting themselves is very, very different. It's far more entitled. It's far more me. It's not giving up yourself for others. It's putting yourself at the center in order to get the glory in some kind of sense. I was speaking to a very famous filmmaker. I think it was last year. He was a producer, and he was going to be making a film with a very famous actor in Hollywood who is involved in the environmental scene. You can probably think of who that is. And they were going to do a movie about climate change activists, okay, the sort of young activists who are helping to save the world. And they embarked on doing this story. And within a very short period of time, probably weeks, maybe months, they had to cancel the project because they realized that the people, the Greta Thunberg types, weren't this kind of moral actor who's genuinely got their heart in the right place. They were doing it for social credibility. They were doing it for Instagram likes, and it wasn't really anything to it beyond that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is approaching the polarization issue at the moment seems to be more of an issue about getting the narrative straight and less to do with your current political view in the moment. It seems to be we need to go like underneath the skin to the narrative level and get the narrative straight. And I guess what I'm trying to do is pair that concept up with the fact that you were mentioning that now villains are more interesting than the heroes, and we're having to like rewrite like what's coming to us through music and through television and movies are generally movies that where the hero's kind of boring and laughed at, and the hero is the exciting one, and we're more fascinated with the villain figure now. And there's this jester like thing where we've now inverted everything, where every transcendent moment in a movie scene with grief or intimacy now has to be punctuated with an ironic joke or a silly comment that just takes us away from it. And it's like we're in our nihilistic, depressed, moral relativism society, we're just losing touch with what's really important. There might be a lot there for you to juggle with, but if you have any thoughts on that to help make sense of all this, I think there's something to this.
I think you're precisely right. I mean, look, in my book series, Orphan X, I'm playing with that all the time. I'm going to write a series about an assassin who is, when he's taken as a child and raised to be an assassin, and the first thing his handler tells him is, the hard part won't be making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And it's really a series about a character who was, raised to do all sorts of terrible things, but also had like his Achilles heel was this, the flickering pilot light was that he wanted always to learn the one thing he was never taught, which is how to speak the strange language of intimacy, how to do good, and how to hold a center in the world that actually is human. And it's kind of weird because I think so much of our stories lately are about like big shadow integration. A close friend of mine, Sean Ryan, created a brilliant TV show called The Shield. And The Shield, in a lot of ways, kicked off like the nuclear arms race of anti-heroes. Then you get Walter White in Breaking Bad. You get Sons of Anarchy. You get Tony Soprano. Like everything kind of rolls. And it was all like the most and the darkest and finding all that. And we mentioned how this, whether it's Grendel, whether it's Maleficent, whether it's Wicked, we're constantly seeing these inversions because our story's gone topsy-turvy. And I think right now there's real opportunity in the culture of storytelling. This is something I'm very much trying to do with my series, but I'm seeing it in, for instance, there's a new TV show called The Pit on HBO that's like a remake of ER, let's say, in a way. You can think of it as a rebooted, reimagined version of ER. It stars Noah Wyle. And it's very much at the center of it is like a good man who is flawed, but is constantly making the best choices he possibly can under immense pressure to help the most people that he can. And we used to have something in Hollywood. There was a term that was thrown around a lot called competence porn for movies like The Martian or Apollo 13, right? All these movies that showed people doing incredible things. And what I think is, and what I'm predicting is, what I'm seeing in my own writing and when I'm out on book tour is, we're moving into an era where people, it's not as much competence porn, it's more about orienting people towards meaning. That's the kind of narratives that people are being drawn to now. And how do you do that? How can we breathe new life into them in a way? Let's say that they sort of filled their mark in a way that the story got old and it got too boring and now everything's coming apart. So it's like, well, maybe all the villains in Disney were just misunderstood. Let's tell every story from their perspective. I did a lot of this when I was reinventing the characters for Batman. I mean, my premise for doing, I wrote a limited series called Pain and Prejudice about the Penguin. And my premise was, if you're the Penguin, then Batman is a bully, basically. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's tougher. And so we're doing all these things and we're showing all these different modes of strength and idiosyncrasy. And I think it's time to start to return to some core archetypal hero based stories that have, a lot of flaws and nuance and complication, that integrate the kind of greater social awareness that we have, and that can present them with as much depth and entertainment and amusement and nuance and
Yeah.
complexity and humor, but without it being the cynical wry aside or just competing to make something ever darker and ever more pushing of the
Yeah.
edge. Because at a point, you just don't care. I mean, one of the things Pajot points out is that the term a symbol is something that unifies and uplifts.
Yeah.
That's what a symbol is.
Yeah.
And the term diabolical literally means to
Yeah.
disintegrate into its constituent parts. And so you can see that culturally in some ways, where you go from like Rembrandt to Cubism is starting to take things apart, right? And Cubism is still amazing, but then if you look at a lot of modern art now, you're like,
That's
the whole
like,
point now is that you're just seeing the artist express himself. It's a little bit what Jackson Pollock did. Jackson Pollock has the famous splashy paintings, and he called himself an action painter because he wanted the canvas that you can see him in motion. You can actually see the motion of the artist himself. It's very opposite of what Caravaggio was doing, who's a masterful narrative storyteller.
very different.
And so as we disintegrate, and then so you and look, there's parts of this that are amazing, like the way that Faulkner took apart narrative in The Sound and the Fury. That's one story told from four perspectives. The way that happens in Rashomon, the Kurosawa, or the way that E. E. Cummings starts to play with poetry, that the arrangement on the page and the breaking of form is good. But if you carry this out, it's like Dadaism is fine once. You can hang one toilet on a wall, a urinal on a wall in a museum once and go, well, what is art? And blah, 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 blah. But it doesn't nourish you. It doesn't give you the things that you need. And I feel like we've played out this deconstruction all the way into dust. And now let's build some stuff back up again that we can look to, that we look to, we raise our gaze to, and that has an effect that is unifying. And not, old and trite and cheesy and like an old fashioned, good natured narrative. There's ways that we need to do that. And I think it's our responsibility when people talk about, well, how are we supposed to compete, with TikTok as novelists? I always say, look, that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is to try to create something that is so compelling or immersive that we can draw people away, and that we can play with the form, and we can integrate aspects that are modern to keep holding people's interest. And we've always had to do this. It's not like Michelangelo could paint whatever he wanted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He had to please the head of the studio, who was the Pope, but he still could do things that were incredible. So all through history, Shakespeare, when he was writing, when Queen Elizabeth was on the throne, everything, there was a lot about virginal, pure leadership. And then when King James ascended, he was obsessed with the occult. So there's where you start to get the witches in Macbeth. So there's all these ways we can always have an excuse to go, well, that's what the market shows. But the aim for it is to try to come up with something that is innovative and that holds the interest. One example of that I think is really true, just a quick side anecdote. So I happen to like opera a good amount. I remember when I first came to LA, I was a kid. I was like 22 years old, 23 maybe. But I remember I went to the opera and I was like the youngest person there by like 180 years. I just was thinking, like, is opera even going to be an art form anymore? Like 100 years? Is it just going to be La Scala in Milan and New York and that's it? Right. And, there's a lot of ways to be thinking about this in terms of theater and the arts and musicals. And I think about Hamilton, which was this incredible sensation. I remember carpooling my daughter and her and all her friends. Like, if you told somebody that there would be a musical about, America's founding fathers, that every kid who had access to the soundtrack, would be singing and playing with. And what he did was so amazing because it was so radically new, and yet it was so revivifying of something that was traditional and institutional. So he cast people who look different and feel different in certain ways, come from different backgrounds in these roles, right? He's using elements of rap and unconventional things, but he's breathing new life. And everybody that he casts in Hamilton embodies the same virtues of the founding fathers who they represent. It's unbelievable amount of merit and skill and grace and clarity and multi-talent with acting and singing and movement and core. It's just so he did something that was new, but he embodied and wrapped it and made it relevant again to a whole other generation in a way that was fairly spectacular. And I think there's a responsibility that we have, instead of throwing up our arms and going, well, we can't possibly compete with TikTok. And look, is it hard going up against, teams of addiction specialists who are backed with deep machine learning algorithms to maximally addict you, yeah, it's really, really hard. But, if parents continue to be parents with boundaries, and if schools can start to get parameters around what they're doing with technology with kids, where they can use it as a tool and come in and out and also expand their attention spans in other ways. And if artists can start to make things, or entertainers that have deeper value, and we can draw people to it, there's ways I think that we can start to step back from the abyss.
Well, it's interesting that you've painted the trajectory of art going from sort of, something that aimed towards the heavens, and now something that's aiming towards clicks. Like that's what's happened in art, going from Caravaggio or Rubens or Michelangelo, or all of those great Renaissance masters, and also before that Byzantine iconography. And now it's not just sticking a urinal on the wall. It's, I grew up in the UK. I went to art college in Canterbury, and just down the road was one of the famous sort of British young artists. I think her name was Tracy Emin. One of her most famous pieces is just an unmade bed with, condom wrappers, and it's just disgusting. And that's what is in the galleries there. And there's this downwards trajectory into the more grotesque, more profane. And there seems to be this breaking down of categories constantly. And I guess you could make this correlation towards like the trans movement, which is breaking down the categoricals of male and female, with the exception of someone that was born with both, or someone who identifies. And there's this constant fragmenting, which is the definition of diabolical, right? Like you said, it's the opposite of unifying and raising upwards. And what I've also noticed when talking about narratives here is this is also kind of happening in movies. Like the quality of films being made today, it doesn't seem to be at the same caliber as it used to be, let's say, I don't know, in the 50s or something, where you mentioned Kurosawa. He made a movie in 1952 called Ikiru. Have you seen that movie called Ikiru? So I was on a layover in Amsterdam with my girlfriend at the time, and she was still asleep. I decided to put it on in the morning, and I watched it from start to finish, and it had such a profound effect on me as like a 23-year-old that later on that night in Amsterdam, I bought a ring and proposed to my wife, and she's about to have our third baby any day now. So this is the power that films can have. And it had nothing to do with marriage. That was the crazy thing. It was just so profound and moving. And I just don't see that happening in films anymore, or art to the same level. Unless you might find a Terrence Malick film, like A Hidden Life, you're not getting that. And I was wondering, like, why you think that is? Is it economic forces? Is it social? Do you have any explanation for it?
I think in the absence of greater meaning that moors us in something, what we've allowed is we've allowed the partisan and the political to creep into every category as the top thing.
Yeah.
So we no longer have the ethics of a field. Are you a judge, or an activist judge, or a judge who's fighting against activist judges? I don't know. Are you a studio, or are you making films that empower a subgroup so you can win awards and then you can be seen as a hero? And so the primary job always of a writer, or for me, I'm a writer and primarily a novelist. There's an ethic that binds that field. And that means I will not make propaganda. And I was very, very resistant, like in terms of having, we need you to have a sensitivity reader. I was like, I'm vehemently opposed to that. I'm fascinated with subject matter experts. I want to get everything right. If I'm writing Mexican characters, I grew up in California. Family members all around. I have a friend who's a brilliant Pulitzer Prize nominee, one of the greatest Mexican-American living writers. I'm going to go to him to make sure I get shit right so I don't look stupid, the same way I check other things. But I'm not going to have some other 22-year-old graduate of an intersectionality program dictate to me what that is. And we've seeded almost all of these things. Now, you mentioned transgenderism. It's a very interesting and complicated topic. Now, so I differ with some of my more conservative friends and colleagues in that I do think that there is a very rare condition where people are transgender. Maybe I don't know what the numbers are. Maybe it's 1.5 kids at all of UCLA or something. So I have, family member who is transgender, who transitioned as an adult after 2 years of therapy. I think it's like Klinefelter syndrome. I think it's like there are some things that are extremely rare that can still happen, and that's what it is.
Yep.
But there's this crazy thing that has happened where the status of what we've allowed with transgenderism, or claims of transgenderism, we've completely assigned a sort of sacred status to that. And I didn't really understand this till I had a series of conversations with Jonathan, because it's so confusing. Jordan's talked a lot about a psychogenic epidemic that's happening around this. I mean, you're aware of some of that. But one of the things Jonathan talks about is when the right goes too far, what happens is that it gets too much the same and too rigid. So obviously that's like Hitler's Germany. Or you think about like a typical image of deep red would be like inbreeding or
Yep.
deliverance. And the left is identified mostly when they go too far, because the left is high trait openness is a set trait. That's what defines somebody from the left versus the right, is too much hybridization. And so there's a very interesting notion if you think about, like, let's take a
Yep.
church, just because it's an easy example. So a church
Right.
is designed like a cross, and then at the altar there's a cross that's elevated up, and
Yep.
then above that there's usually a cross, and the church is at the center of a whole city, and that's the governing, uplifting symbol that everybody sort of, that the culture organized itself around to. Let's talk about in medieval times, or in, even how in city planning
Yep.
in a lot of places in America. But there's also gargoyles that are on the church, because there is a fringe and there is a place for the fringe, and that fringe is a hybrid fringe. A gargoyle is two things at once.
Yep.
And they exist, and they have sort of twofold purpose. One is that they're hybrid because they're part of what's outside and part of what's inside. They're two things at once, but they're at the edge of a church because they're in the liminal space. And that means that they're scaring away evil spirits and people who might wish to do harm, who won't pass under that gaze. But if you're humble enough to pass under that gaze, then you enter the church, or you enter the center, let's say, knowing that you have, in some ways, that you're humble, you've been humbled by that gaze, and you're going in for a shared purpose. It means you don't get to bring your own whatever idiosyncrasies exist and can and should thrive on the fringe into the church. I think a lot of what we have seen happening here with the extreme excesses of the far left is they've taken the gargoyle kind of off the fringe of a building and brought it in and put it up on the altar to be worshipped. And so you can see this to say, like, if you're an 8-year-old kid who thinks that you're trans, like, no teacher can tell you otherwise, not a psychologist, your parents can't.
Yes.
You change the language. Like, they're afforded this sort of divine status in a way we would never allow if a kid said, hey, I'm bipolar and I need lithium. And so there's this allowance, and it does a huge disservice, I think, to the exceedingly fewer people who actually are trans, because you've had this stampede of empathetic allies who have turned the whole situation upside down, and I think are causing an enormous amount of backlash. But there's this battle right now between, this fear of too much identity, that's very much what the right is, that everything must be uniform. And that was Hitler. Like, Hitler wasn't scared of Jews, as people say. He was disgusted by Jews. He had a high disgust threshold. He killed rats, and then he killed dogs in the street. Then he killed the homeless. Then he killed the Jews and the gays and the Slavs. It keeps going. It's why he used a lot of fire imagery, right? You burn what disgusts you. It's a burning thing until all things are uniform at the inside. You're just down to like gleaming white bone. And the left, basically, the problem is if you invite the fringe into the center,
Right.
the fringe has a fringe, and the fringe's fringe has a fringe, and the fringe's fringe has a fringe. And soon enough, you see all these people who are afraid to speak up against someone who's clearly mentally ill because they've dressed themselves in some garbs of perverse sexuality. And they're afraid that they're on the wrong side of history because they're speaking up against, Harvey Milk or Martin Luther King, when it's not the case. In certain cases, I happen to be somebody, and part of my awareness of this, what was so interesting was I discovered a lot of this in conversations that I had during and extracurricularly around the Exodus seminar that we did at the Daily Wire, is this mediation. But I think I'm very much on the fringe. And so it's been an interesting undeceiving about the necessity, importance for the center to hold, so that the fringe can actually thrive, because the center needs the fringe, because without the fringe, new ideas and people and ideas don't get in to update the center so that it can thrive, and so that we can navigate complex change together.
Yeah,
but it's a very interesting thing for me going in as sort of the predominantly, I'm from a more liberal background. I'm a writer. I have super high trait openness. My community is varied. I have a lot of gay friends, colleagues, family. It's a very varied space. But one of the things that I started to recognize was there has to be a mechanism for the fringe to hold and for the fringe to thrive and do the job it needs to do for the center to hold. But the center also, it should, when it holds well, there should be grace, and there should be forgiveness, and it should be minimal possible force. And like, it should exemplify a center that everybody can participate in if they are willing to show an aspect of humility to a shared set of values.
Yeah. Well, this is why it's so sacred. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about that, because it reminds me of, I think, what Douglas Murray said. I think he said something like, he wasn't sure that the political left and the political right can really exist without the religious surround. I think that's what he described it as. Like, you needed something. I don't know exactly what he meant there, but it reminds me of what you were just saying there. And in terms of incorporating the extremes, there's the symbolism of Christ born in the manger between the ox and the donkey, or the ass. And there's you have the ox representing purity, and the ass, the donkey, representing, you know, uncleanliness. And there's some kind of integration there. Even the cross itself bringing forth the various quadrants or the extremes to a central point. And there's just something so remarkable about just even the visuals of that, and the symbolism of that.
I've such rejuvenated after Gospels, but I've had ongoing, like, incredible affinity for Christians and Christian thought. I mean, I was educated in a Jesuit high school. I was far and away the most liberal kid at the high school, and the Jesuits were great. It's like, make your argument, make your case. You're going to read the Old Testament. You're going to read the New Testament. There was this educational thing that was put forth, and it was very, very essential.
Yeah.
But, you know, one of the things that's also amazing is the images that you're describing. It's hard even to grasp how radical that is, to have a God who comes in on a donkey and is born in a manger, and then is venerated in his moment of seemingly greatest defeat, which is in fact greatest triumph.
Yeah.
You know, the full moment that the whole world inverts. It's incredible. And there's so much in Christianity that is, and Judaism. And I will say, look, if you go back to the Hellenistic tradition too, the Greco-Roman tradition, what I love so much about it is its maximum emphasis on freedom and free will. So Socratic reasoning isn't a teacher telling you what to do. It's asking questions. It's pulling forth out of you what you'll enter into. And Judaism, the whole key is it's a freely entered into covenant. It's not coercive. And with Christianity, there's so many aspects of Christianity, of these sort of well springs of Western tradition, that make so much space for the fringe, that makes so much space for people who think differently.
Yes.
And, you know, Christianity really struck me in a lot of ways that were significant when we were discussing Gospels, how, you know, I mean, going all the way back, you know, even in Judaism, when, you know, Moses doesn't enter the promised land, it's, you know, but Caleb is one of two people who enters the promised land, and he's from the mixed multitude. It's like half of the people are outsiders. And there's this constant, you know, admonitions. I think it's Miriam, who's Aaron's wife, who scolds Moses for marrying a dark-skinned black Ethiopian. And she says he shouldn't marry her. And God turns her like alabaster white, which is the color of a leper, and moves her to the outside of the camp. Right. Because it's like, oh, you want to be pure? You want to exclude people in your rigid purity? Off you go. Yeah. And there's all these tales about how those two things are integrated and mediated. And every time you might think that it would come down on a side of more rigidity, or, you know, might have been interpreted in terms, you know, through the flawed or corrupt institutions of man and of men, like the Inquisition, in ways where it has like this overbearing force. It's so fascinating with the scripture and all these ways that you think it's going to come down on the side of the center in a way that's very concrete, but instead goes the other way. And there's all these allowances that are made. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, one of the things we were exploring is the notion that this kind of symbolic thinking, or, you know, whichever way you take it, because we came in for people even who might not be spiritual or religious, is in fact the primary mode beyond even scientific thinking of ways that we organize the world and hold together. So in a lot of ways, you know, you could read 1,000 studies and think pieces and op-eds and data sets about AI, right? Or you could tell that sort of story about the Tower of Babel and what happens if engineering is unmoored from a defining subsidiary value set that's organized in an ethic of agreed upon value. And one of them can kind of nutshell the whole thing in a way that's almost predictive and give you a handle on it. And that's just as meaningful and perhaps even more useful than the whole other collection of ideas and ways that we tend to approach things. And I think we have to bring those two people who think separately in those different ways back together into some kind of union again, or at least be able to translate between the two.
Well, I've got to say, first of all, I loved what you did on the Gospel series. There were so many nuggets to that helped open my eyes to so much. And I think it really sits well in the time at the moment, because I think we've started to realize that, just as Nietzsche had warned us, that as man had walked away from God, there would be these cultural and personal crises, convulsions, as we sort of deal with the ramifications of that, as we move on from the correct transcendent central belief system, and that people will cling to anything in those moments, even if they're false gods. And I wanted to ask you about what's happening today and whether we are now watching the rise of new false religions and its deities, whether that be radical environmentalism and Greta Thunberg, or anti-Zionism and Kanye, or this sort of tech utopianism and Elon. What do you make of all this? Do you think that those kinds of movements are looking in the wrong place for meaning?
Look, we're all worshiping something. You can either be aware of what you're worshiping or you can be unaware of it.
Yep.
I was out the other day and I saw these, those Veladora candles that are in Catholic churches that people light? They're tall candles with like the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
And there was a number of them that was set up somewhere that was like, and they were supposed to be kitschy, purposefully kitschy. And one of them had Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and one had Hillary Clinton, and one of them had Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Sounds very LA.
And it's this very sort of like kitschy thing, and people bought them and they're set up. And I'm looking at them in this thing, and one of the things I realized was, kitschy and tongue in cheek or not, they're set up for sale here in this place that's like an altar.
Right.
Right. And so you can't avoid the things that you place into issues of prominence. Like, we have a myth making mechanism to us. If we find a tribe in the middle of the Amazon that's cut off from all of civilization, we know certain things about them. We know they're going to have opposable thumbs. We know they're going to have eyelids, and we know that they're going to have a hero myth and a hero story that's integral, that has all of the parts. Every culture in the world has this. It has certain constituent steps to it, because it teaches us how to navigate the internal and the external unknown. We think in stories. And so, a lot of people, if you stop them on the streets and go, why are you, like, one of the things I think about a lot with whether it's Gaza, whether it's abortion, whether it's fill in the blank anywhere, if you go, well, before all this was all over the internet and the news, how much of your time and attention were you putting to it? Like, was this something that was like an adamant core part of your existence? Or is it something that sort of his emerged? And everyone could say, well, it's my awareness. But as you and I have discussed, like, our awareness is being turned on a dial. We're not really designed to have news from all around the world of every single possible interpretation of everything 24/7. It's not like we're watching the 8 o'clock news once a day or reading a newspaper once a day. It's 24/7. If we had, immediate iPhone footage of what every person thought everywhere in the world during all of World War II, I don't know where we would be right now. And so one thing that's very important to me is to ask people when they say, I'm just so outraged, I'm disgusted, I'm anxious, I'm terrified, whether it's the Trump administration, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Putin, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the world, is to say, well, how much of your actual time and energy and resources are you putting into that in some ways that is concrete? Because if not, it's not real. It's just a sort of nervous system loop that we have from having our nervous systems hacked constantly. We are being made to worship things. We'll either know what they are or we won't know what they are. And so one of the benefits you have if you think in symbolic terms in a lot of ways is that you have a sort of structure of what you hold to be sacred. And I'm not implying that you can only do that if you have a divine religious belief, though there are arguments to be made for the clarity and durability of that. There's obviously people who can do this and hold, but there's a reason we've seen a lot of the ethics get overrun, where you're like, is the science captured here? Is adolescent psychology been captured? Has Hollywood been captured for pure filmmaking, or as pure as possible filmmaking and storytelling? We've seen the partisan creep into everything. And if you're obsessed on being on the right side of history in all these different ways that are complicated that you don't really know that much about, and you're reading one swath of news sources, it's so complicated to understand any issue. It's just, it's incredibly complicated. You have to devote it. You got to leave a lot of skin on the road, and you have to be, the fool precedes the master. You have to be wrong about so much. You have to be willing to be wrong about so much. You have to be willing to learn from everyone who you talk to who disagrees with you. Mm-hmm. It's exhausting. Well, part of the
go.
Well, one of the things that happens to me constantly when I'm doing some of the bridge building stuff I've done politically is, I was on a call with a Republican congressman. We were talking about environmental bills and role. This was during President Trump's first term. And he looks at me and he laughs. I was on a Zoom call with him. He goes, you guys think that every time we roll back environmental regulations, it's because we want to dump toxins in rivers. And I just laughed. And I was like, you know what? You're totally right. That's like, I just felt like it's like getting pantsed on a call where I was just like, that's literally is my only frame of reference. So tell me. And he's like, it takes 3 years to build an off ramp in New York. Like boom, 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 boom. Like we're stifled. So I was like, okay, let me come back to you on the things that I'm asking for participation or post partisan action. Let me go do some more work and looking into this. And so, I went off. I talked to Jordan. We talked to a very prominent regulatory expert. Looked into a lot of the stuff of what's overgrowth, what's undergrowth, and you start to look at it, and then you start to see it in all these ways. Like, I remember there was a little small business venture that I was running, and at one point I got a call from the IRS, and they were like, "Look, for you to do this, where's your legal?" Like I'd hired somebody to do something, and the person who I'd hired an assistant for like $20 an hour, and that person listed me on some form or something for as the last thing she worked for unemployment. And they were saying, well, where's your onboarding document? And where's your scope of work? And where's your legal? And and it was like, wait, this was to hire someone for 3 hours to help an editor in a room. And so then you start to realize that all of these workers' comp, like workers' rights, all these bills, all these things, all this regulatory stuff that sounds so good, it's a real partnership. I called a friend of mine who's a CTO of a Fortune 500 company. He's like, oh yeah, that's in there all the time because you just crush competition. We have a whole HR department. We have a whole legal department. We have all the departments who do this. And the benefit of having a lot of this is that smaller companies and businesses can't compete because they can't do it. You're always going to be criminalized. So like I would have had to spend, $5,000 to onboard someone to pay him $20 an hour to work for 3 hours, which I was doing as a favor for someone who was out of work during COVID. And so as you dig in, you start to have a lot of the perceptions crumble of what you thought. But in a way, you have to be open to that, and you have to be willing to look foolish or to learn or to call people and go, God, it looks like I got this wrong. Like, give me the whole other tranche of it. And that comes down a lot to our ability to have trained or disciplined minds. Like, are we confident enough that we can even allow in a conversation? So, Carl Rogers, the psychologist?
No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I do.
He's the one we make fun of a lot. Who's like, how did that make you feel? Okay. Like, he's the sort of like, and so he's interesting. We were talking about perspective, and he's one of the first psychologists who picked. Patients used to lay on their back while Freud would sit here and smoke his cocaine pipe, and they'd look at the ceiling. And so, as we're talking about Rashomon and perspective change, Rogers picked him up and sat him face to face. So this perspective change, it moves also across the soft sciences, the sciences, as we start to play with different things. And he believed that to deal with a patient properly, you had to have unconditional positive regard. And that means if your patient has done something terrible or had something terrible or shameful done to them, that you still need to show them a regard in order to help them. But he realized that to do that, you have to set your nervous system in resonance with theirs. And so you've seen this, I'm sure, if you have friends who are like super manic and energetic, you leave. There's like an emotional osmosis. Or if you're around someone who's very depressed and dysthymic, you'll kind of walk out and you feel heavier. So he was all about opening up to really resonate, to understand fully, and then to reconstitute yourself as an adult, sort of, and then you can help somebody. And that's a requirement, I think, in order to, and I think this is one of the advantages that I have, perhaps, in coming to cultural or political complicated discussions, because I'm not primarily interested in politics. I'm primarily interested in stories, and I'm a novelist. And when I'm writing a novel, what I'm trying to do is to embody a character and pull their face mask on and see the world through their eye holes and write fully from them and not write a bunch of straw men. And so part of this is it's a foundational act of confidence or assurance or strength if you can talk to somebody who says, look, you start a conversation. I have a completely different view than you do on Ukraine. To go, okay, let me let it in. Let me relax my system. Let me open up to it. Let me hear everything you have to say. Let me try to articulate it even as well as well or better than you might for language that would match someone like me in language that makes most sense to me. And then you're sort of bent out of shape, right? Because your brain gets a little bit warped in your nervous system, but you have the strength to come back. Then you talk to other people who are experts, and usually you overcorrect a little and you swing and you integrate and assimilate the information, and then you have it. And this predominance that we've had around safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions and unfriending everyone we don't like and canceling speakers, what we've really eroded is our strength of ability to entertain ideas or to make our own ideas more powerful by steelman testing them. And once that goes, we are wide open from attacks. Like you were talking about how us being attacked through our primary values, right? Like the diversity in America, or the free speech that we enjoy here. That, you know, when you have Khomeini who's praising the student protesters for being on the right side of history, it's like, really? Can people do that in Tehran? Are they allowed to do that there? Like, are we listening to you now for what constitutes this? But when we fail that, and then the people who we've taught become professors and enter the workforce and enter institutions, we have people who are undisciplined and they can't hold the line to say, look, I understand that this particular instance that you're promulgating is for your right as a self-defined minority in X, Y, or Z category, but it doesn't matter. You're not allowed to break the rules. You're not allowed to have different rights than anybody else. You're not allowed to stop traffic. You're not allowed to destroy art. You're not allowed to shoot people or kill people or punch people. You're not allowed to take over college campuses and shove janitors. You're not allowed to do all these things. That's not how this, in fact, works. It's illegal. And if you choose to exercise your right to practice civil disobedience, you will be charged and you'll be brought up. And if you conduct yourself in a way that is unerringly and staggeringly moral, then maybe you have a chance to win more people to your cause who can see your justness and the unjustness of this law. But we're very undisciplined, and people come in with one flick at us and we puddle. We either yield or we get overly reactive the other direction.
Well, you know, at the beginning of this, you said that everyone worships something. And I think one of the interesting things has been that I think a lot of people, especially the ones that I grew up with and speak to most often, who identify themselves as atheists, don't think they have a belief system. They don't think they worship anything. And so for someone like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, what would you say, you know, I don't know if you've ever spoken to them, but what would you say that they believe in? What is it that they are worshiping in that sense?
Look, it's so complicated. I know Sam some, and I'm familiar with Dawkins. I mean, and his work, and that he's become a cultural Christian now, which is kind of interesting. Look, I think there's a slight difference in practice than in theory. You know, and I don't want to talk about either of them. I haven't, like, I'm more comfortable talking even critically about people who are friends and colleagues where I've had a lot more discussion time with them. I mean, I know Sam some peripherally, but what I will say is that an impulse that's the vehement or angry impulse that is atheist, let's remove that. I think that's the Luciferian intellect.
Okay, explain.
Lucifer. Well, Milton's Lucifer in Paradise Lost, you know, the brightest angel. He's the intellect that falls in love with itself.
Okay.
And a lot of times you have people who say, well, I can explain it, and it's this, and here's the rule, and here's the law, and here's my theory, and here's the data, and it's this constant whirlwind that to me isn't necessarily have an understanding of how one can move through the world more resonant with meaning. I think you need different stakes in the ground with that. Ben Shapiro said something really interesting to me. It was another one of these moments where, you know, Ben and I were preceding Exodus, certainly, that there's a lot of things that I admire Ben Shapiro about, full stop. There's a lot of partisan issues that we've been on the opposite side of. But he said something really interesting to me. We were talking about the institutions and the ways that they're failing. And he was like, yeah, a lot of them were they're still going on fumes from when they were connected to more traditional values. And there's this interesting thing that we're now one single lifespan away from World War II, right? People left at one time after World War II, the CEO of every single major American corporation was a war vet from World War II and had a ingrained understanding that one of the jobs of your industry was to make money, to thrive, to take care of your workers, and also to do good for America. That's been completely lost in the neoliberal, you know, sort of whirlwind of all these things. But I was thinking a lot about that, and you know, it's like part of it was I grew up in a very kind of intensely atheist background, though I did go get sent to Jesuit high school, which was great. I went kicking and screaming and hated it for about 5 minutes, and then was like, oh, there's a lot of wisdom here. And I was given a lot of room and shown a lot of grace and given a lot of opportunity to thrive there. But, you know, you do need to have at some point, if every single discussion at Harvard is a free speech issue and the students can go raise a GoFundMe and hire a constitutional lawyer, and then the faculty has to hire their lawyers. And like, I don't see how if at some point you don't have a buck stops here set of foundational values that you can just say, this is not conduct that's becoming, and that's the value and template here. everything has a tendency to become this sort of overgrown cancerous HR department of like endless negotiation, and we need to have stops on it. We need things to be more foundational. There's a ton of bureaucratic crust and sort of ossified and codified corruption that's clogging all these systems. At one point, Yale had, I want to say it was 3.5 administrators for every student at Yale. So who are you starting to service then? Like, are you actually taking care of the student, or do you need to have, you know, more money that is getting paid to pay for all these jobs? I mean, what do you think? Like, if somebody has a job that's an inclusion-oriented job, and there's a whole department, and then all of a sudden there's all this funding and studies and research, is there a point that they actually would ever say, hey, guess what? We finally got it right. We got the balance right now, and I think our program should now be defunct. As you add administrative classes, you're servicing more and more things that don't have to do with the student. And look, this is another thing I think that this is a better answer, because I'm a little bit rambling as I'm thinking about this. Mm-hmm. I think we have been for a lot of years now floating away from our avatars of meaning. And by that, what I mean is, oh, are you a, let me think how to best put this. Are you a politician? That means that you represent your people, right? You're a politician, so you care about your community. None of us believe that, right? You're a journalist, so you're impartial. How many of us believe that now, right? You're in charge of the science around gender issues in, you're a gender institute. Right. How much of us believe that? And so I tell this story. My dad went to this great East Coast private school called Roxbury Latin, and they were one of the original look to the left of you, look to the right of you, one of you won't be here next year. And it was Latin and it was Greek, and he memorized Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It was this incredible thing. They started with like 45 kids. They graduated 23. It was something like 20 went to Harvard, 2 went to Yale, 1 went to Princeton. It just was like this very fine, intense academic experience. And so I was thinking about this when the college admissions scandal broke. You remember that scandal, yeah?
No, I don't.
Okay, so this was huge international news. Basically, a bunch of parents from kind of affluent schools in like top level schools were there was a bribe that was being set up. One of the schools was out here in LA, and they were basically like photoshopping their kids' heads into a water polo thing to say their kid played water polo, and they were paying things to change test scores. Like, all this stuff was happening, and these kids got into like USC and Stanford and Yale. And when the scandal broke, and there was a number of celebrities that were involved with it who were paying for this, it kind of just became this thing that one of these guys was taking payments and placing these kids, and then he had people at the schools who he was paying to get the kids in, and there was all this sort of manipulation happening by inflating kids' test scores and claiming they were on sports and doing activities they didn't do. And it was a huge story here. It was actually a huge story internationally too. Like, if you look it up, you'll see it dominated. And I was trying to think about why it had such an incredible hold on our cultural attention. And what I realized was it was an emblematic moment of how the avatars of meaning, if you say Stanford or Yale or USC, are completely untethered from what the reality is. And I thought back to my dad's class, which, for better or worse, they were rigorously and intensely trained. If one of them had gone to Yale back then, right, under false pretenses, they would have failed out of Yale because they wouldn't have been Yale material. But everybody intuitively knew, in a way, well, if you cheat with this and you pay this guy and they say your kid did this and they say your kid did that and your kid goes to a good prominent college, we all know they'll kind of be okay. Like, we all kind of know it's bullshit. And so it's so emblematic. And I think in a lot of ways, when you're talking about, let's say adamant atheists, right? There's, in some ways, the anchoring is still to avatars of meaning that have floated away from what's foundational. And so you can't have it to be like, oh, he's really smart. He went to, right, Harvard and Cambridge, or like all these things that were these sort of correct directions for worth in people. I think a lot of the lie has been exposed, okay, right? Like, oh, what a great person. Like, she worked for a pro bono organization her whole life. And you're like, yeah, was it an effective one? A lot of people do great pro bono work. Yeah. A lot of pro bono organizations exist to salary and continue to feed themselves and their own bureaucracy. Yeah. We can't just take all these shorthands for granted.
Okay, well let me try and get to. So are you trying to say that people who identify as atheists aren't really atheists as such, because that term has lost its true meaning and people don't really know what they mean when they say they don't believe in God or they don't worship anything? Is that what you're trying to get at?
No, I'm saying that if you're an atheist, you have a reliance on other institutions or avatars of meaning that float
Oh, I see.
and that are subject in
Yes.
some ways to, so it's like, let's say, good old school, leftist liberal family where you say you go to the best schools, you do the best, you do charity work, and you donate to the right causes, and now you're a good person. Well, what happens when
Yes.
all those avatars of meaning aren't what they were? Right. So if Harvard's no longer
Right. Okay.
Harvard,
I
and
say. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
well, I gave a bunch of money to the ACLU. Well, the ACLU, like I was a Skokie ACLU guy, like back when they fought to protect the rights of Nazis to march because of
Yeah.
free speech, right? And they basically became an activist
Yeah.
organization. So what are you grabbing onto to define meaning? It's very
Yeah.
complicated, and I think it gets very
Yes,
difficult.
I think it's almost
Is
like
that
when Christ said it's like building your life on solid foundation as opposed to something sand like that's moving constantly. And I guess if you're trying to look at what the atheist grounding is in terms of what makes someone a good person or whatever, like I think Sam Harris, again, big fan of a lot of his great work. One of the things he was talking about a lot was effective altruism, like giving to the right charities a percentage of your money in order to do good. But then that I think there was a Bitcoin guy, wasn't there? A guy that like made tons of money in order to do this, but there was like a scam involved. Or what happens if those charities are actually all not putting the money where it's meant to go because we're relying on their promises that they're actually going to do good. Like if that's how you're getting your sense of how you're doing good in the world, it's not a kind of solid foundation that you would get otherwise. Is that closer to what you're getting
yes?
across?
And if you're relying on certain things based on what they represent,
Yeah.
the avatars of what they represent are separate from what they used to represent,
Okay.
even in the last 10 years or 20 years.
Yes. And so how would you compare that to, for example, a Christian, like someone who goes to church and is like an Orthodox Christian? In what sense do they not have that same problem?
Well, I want to be very careful, which is to say, I don't have a belief that atheists are bad people or don't have ethical bearing or don't do like wonderful work and
Yeah.
figure their way through this.
Yeah.
So I want to just make that really clear.
Yes.
Or that if somebody happens to say that they're a believer, that somehow that imbues them with good traits just by dint of them saying the right words or mouthing it. There's a lot of, wolves in
Agreed.
sheep's clothing all the way around on this. And there's a lot of atheists who do incredible work in the world. I do think if you talk to somebody who's religious, like if you ask somebody what they believe or what their value structure is, and they're atheist, it's very hard for them to define it. Whereas I think if you ask a Christian, it will be, or
Yes.
somebody who's a classicist, right? It will be, truth, love, beauty. Christians, it would tend to be self-sacrifice for the overall betterment of the community, for the long-term good of my community.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of values. Now, whether they adhere to them or not, or hypocritical or not, or corrupt,
Yeah.
everybody's hypocritical and corrupt. Every human being is. So it's not like, I never find that an argument when people go, well, people who are religious are so hypocritical. I'm like, well, that's like saying people break the law all the time, so we shouldn't have laws. Like, it doesn't make any sense. We're all aspiring to, adhere to something that is making sense of our lives, and we have different parameters. I think those things are better defined. And I think if you're an atheist, one of the problems that we're having now in a secular society is I do think you can get there in a lot of ways where you have some, I mean, look, Sam is smart as a whip, obviously, and Dawkins is no slouch. And I'm sure that they would have some fairly ready answers. But the question becomes, what sort of institutions do you need to be educated in? In what state of fulsomeness and what level of IQ do you need to be able to have that? Like to be Sam Harris or Dawkins and to be an atheist where you can say, look, here's my, like I trace my rights of the, individual rights, and every person for me goes back here and I source it here and it's reflected here. They can do all of that. But like you need all of these institutions to be working in stunning fashion. You need an incredibly high IQ. You need to be able to have a, very, very strong inherent ethic. There's all these things. And I think that in general, for just describing orientation, everybody needs to have a narrative that is a foundational or founding narrative.
Yes.
And people can have access to that and how to order it.
Okay.
So for me, it's like truth, truth, love, self-sacrifice.
What do you mean by truth, Greg? No, I'm joking. That's the classic Peterson. No, okay. I think what you're getting at here is, so for example, a Christian, I'm using that term loosely here, but someone who's within the Christian faith, let's say, has a very cohesive and very straightforward understanding that can be understood by people of all ages. So, we're made in the image of God, therefore our lives matter. therefore, from that you can derive human rights, for example. You can derive meaning from that because it's all eternal and everything you do matters, to a very, very, very large scale. Whereas from an atheist perspective, and I've spoken and debated with atheists about this problem, where you're grounding your morality in, it's shaky. It's like, well, I believe in reducing suffering, but why? Like, why? If human beings are just another animal on the planet and animals are just killing each other and the sun's going to explode the planet in a billion years or whatever, then all the effort that you've gone to amount to exactly zero. There's no ultimate meaning that's maybe grounding it if we're all just bacteria. Is that what is this along the lines of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and also, look, I mean, I think there's also a ton of room. I mean, look, there's room everywhere for, willful blindness. But one of the things that really gets me is, I mean, I've had some conversations about trying to help. I think no matter who's in power, you always need a strong opposition party. And I always said, I used to spend a lot of time trying to help pull Democrats back from the far left. There are some successes, but obviously not as many as I or anyone who I know hoped. But I would always talk to and try to help Republicans. And now I consider myself very post-partisan. I'm helping where there's good people doing good things. Yep. But, I was on some calls where, we were talking about how to reformulate like a story for Democrats. And people were like, well, patriotism grosses me out. Like, why do you get to say? And that's just disgust. I don't want any religion. We can't alienate other people. I don't want this. And, I don't want that. And it's, for me, it's so much about like the freedom of thinking. And I just had this realization. I got off a call. There was this one woman in particular on a call we were having trying to reconstitute something where it's like, oh, essentially, like, you have nothing that you answer to. You have nothing that you submit to, right? You have nothing that's ever above you. It's not a constitution. It's not the flag. It's not a church. It's not a mosque. It's not a synagogue. There is nothing. And what that means is that you get to go around and have these declarations of yourself, and you judge everybody in the world of how you parse them into whether they're doing good or things that's designed by, a sample group of one. And then you make a determination that they measure or don't measure up to your ever fluid system of morality that's based on absolutely nothing. And you don't think that there's room for willful blindness and tyranny? You don't think that somebody who you envy 5%, who makes a mistake that's a 20% mistake, that you won't push that envy and put that 20% up to 30%? And there's just no mechanisms for it.
Right. But is this what you're referring to when it comes to the Luciferian aspect of it? It's trying to put yourself in place of the arbiter of everything when that's not your place, and then falling in love with yourself, and then as a result falling.
Yeah. You fall in love with your own intellect or ability to think. And you look at these people and you're like, well, okay, so I get it. You're great. I'll tell you what, go flip Ohio. Go get in a bus and go knock on doors and like put this in practice in the world beyond your safe circle of however many followers you have and your safe community where everybody is excluded, don't agree with you. Everything is you. Everything measures up to or doesn't measure up to you. And it's not based on anything. There's no grounding in it.
Wow.
And you can just see it clear as day when it happens, because it's like, oh, I see. And then it's like, that's the vicious excluding. And if there's a truth they don't like, and you can't, it's like, what a lovely thing to just, have the whole world, have yourself be the arbiter of the entire moral order of everything. It's like, you don't want patriotism. You don't want people, America's failed. The Constitution's a failed document and church is all a hoax because blah, 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 the Crusades and the Inquisition. It's like, okay, like you're essentially at a fifth grade level of argument, right? But you're running, you're holding the purse strings to like major power within, an aspect of the culture. There's not any thinking that can tether it any which way. And so, you can think that you're amazing because you've never submitted to anything, but you also see it in people, and you just realize psychologically too, it's like you're angry at something, you're wounded, and I think politics is downstream from psychology in a lot of ways. That's why when I do my political analysis, I rely really heavy on psychology of big five personality structures. Because if you're high trade openness, I'm super high trade openness. I love new ideas, new people. We live in cities a lot of the time. There's different accents and different foods and different ethnicities, and we're in the arts because the arts are all about high trade openness. But if you're lower trade openness, that just means you like borders around things, right? Build a wall is a great slogan. You want a border around gender. right? If a couple people are different this way, a couple people are different that way, that's fine. You don't want to redefine the whole world that way, though. And there's great advantages to being lower in trait openness and higher in trait conscientiousness. I mean, imagine the Native Americans when Europeans were like, hey, here's all these smallpox blankets. If they were like, hold on, we don't want infection, right? Infection of the unknown, too much hybridization, right? That's the gargoyle, letting the gargoyle right in and putting it on the altar right away. And so people's fears can be predictive. So if you're conservative, if you're lower trait openness, there's greater fear of chaos. There's greater fear of invasion. You know, we studied a lot of this, and these are useful things. I'm not saying this in denigrating fashion. You can't have wide open borders. People are more reluctant about having an invasion of a needle through their skin into their body with a vaccination. It's a lot more, I want to mind my space. And that isn't, by the way, a white or colonialist or European value. It's equally distributed across every ethnicity. And as anybody who has any friends who are in different ethnicities, you would actually know that. You wouldn't think that every black and brown person in the world is going to vote Democrat if you've met, you know, a Hispanic grandma, or, you know, it's if you live in the world, you're aware that there's a whole thing. Some people like to live in a community of people who are like them. They have a more set schedule. They like more predictability around them. That's okay. We need that. And so in a lot of ways, conservatives are like the brake pedal and liberals are the gas. And if you just stop the gas, you smash into a wall, or if you go off a cliff. And if you just stand on the brake, you can't go anywhere. And it's this mediation between the two that help us to navigate complicated change. And we have a lot of complicated change coming. And I think maybe that's like kind of my uber point in this. And I appreciate your patience. The conversation's been a little bit rambling, but you've asked a lot of thoughtful questions. So it takes some doing to deliver them. But a lot of, for me, when I'm talking about unity and ignoring these differences, is it's like, we got to get in this car and drive it together. I'd way rather America be driving this car than China or Russia or the Islamic Republic of Iran, or go down the list of other countries. It's very important that we're able to do that. And if we focus on all these differences rather than understanding that some of this variance, not diversity is our strength, but our variance, if we can adhere under a set of values, you know, freedom, fairness, planning for the future, health, prosperity, if we can adhere under values and we can incorporate that into unity, we can then lead the world with the values that I care about the most as someone who's even on the fringe. And those are the values that also protect the rights that matter a great deal to me, which is rights for different minority groups, you know, which is freedom of religion, which is more rights for women, right? Which is rights for people who have different sexual orientations. These are things for me that they exist and thrive in a place where we can understand all of this.
Right. Okay. You've just said a lot of stuff there that I'm sure we can unpack for hours, but I love this symbolism of the Luciferian fall or the Luciferian phenomena, because the temptation is right there all the time. And like you've described, everyone thinking of themselves as the main character and the judge of the world, and that everything falls on you to determine if it's right or wrong. But it's totally blind and arrogant in the sense that it doesn't see its own flaws. Like when you go to the comment section, everyone thinks the universe revolves around them. And since becoming familiar with your work and the work you've been doing with, you know, Us the Story, and also Johnny, who's a mutual friend, I've been paying more attention to the places where I'm noticing the temptation for you know, engaging in a kind of radicalization or polarized form of communication in the comments, let's say, when I spend time on social media. Now, of course, the best way to get away from that is to put the phone aside and take a walk in the park or something. But one of the best places that I found is stepping into the church I go to, the Orthodox church I go to. And when you walk in, you suddenly realize that you're not the main character of the story. It's not about you. Not everything. It's not up to you to judge the world. It's in fact that's kind of the perversion. That's the message of almost the fall in Eden. It's taking on that knowledge of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. That's that knowledge of morality, and wielding it for yourself away from God. And that's the kind of temptation of Satan. And it's such a relief going into that place, and you're reminded, just like you were mentioning Solzhenitsyn earlier, that the line between good and evil is between me. It's like Ali, like you're the problem here, and so that is so depolarizing and unifying at the same time that I don't know whether you wanted to make any comment on that, but it seems like that seems to be one of the places that I think people can experience relief from this madness that's going on online.
Well, and that's the good news, that you're the problem, because if it's not you, you're doomed. you know?
Yeah.
I mean, the other place to find that, I think, is going into groups of people who are not like-minded. I have very few friends who I agree with on everything. I'm constantly going into groups of people who think differently. And I learned so much with that. And it's another thing that's sort of humble. I mean, unless you want to just go in and argue and scream at everybody and not listen. But like, you know, if you go into to people who think about the world in different ways or have areas of expertise that are different, that's my favorite place to be, is where I'm a neophyte in a room of experts and just, you know, catching up and figuring it out and integrating. And that's another good reminder, because there's a whole other systems of thinking or different ways to think about topics that don't place you at the center of it. And so I think that there's so many things, you know, this whole, you know, tendency to unfriend and to cancel and to unfollow and to do all these things where we're cultivating our little online world. It's just no reflection of how to engage or how to think or how to be reminded that you're not at the center of everything. And in fact, if you are, it's horrible. It's like a kind of hell.
Yeah.
We have all those rules. You know, one of the other things I was thinking about, you know,
precisely.
you're talking a lot back and forth between religious imagery, as we are in this, and the rest of it. I mean, one of the other things I realized is that there's certain notions that we have to have take hold in some manner. And so the notion of original sin, whether you believe that as a literalist or not, or whatever your senses of meaning are, it's a notion that is integral, I think, or else it wouldn't be there in a foundational seed that has had the level of, even if you're an atheist, in a foundational seed that has enjoyed the level of evolutionary success as a story, and that this is at the core of it. And part of original sin means you can never believe that you are the true arbiter of what the right side of history is. It's like, it's a constant thing in you to understand, I am flawed, I have shortcomings, right? I should always be aspiring to something, however imperfectly, however many times I fall down, I should be aspiring to something better than me. And I'm aware that I have problems within myself. I can't just go to the right schools and donate the right money and, you know, tweet the right messages and be completely on the right side of history in all ways. There's always things, if I explore deeper, that are problems for us. So if you try to just eliminate that, that's another notion that's going to come back. Like we're talking about that we all worship something, we just don't know what. It's similar too. I mean, maybe your notion of original sin gets ported over to being an environmental catastrophist, right? Like, mommy mother nature's mad at us and I'm being punished for something. There's all these ways that it happens. But the other thing that I've noticed a lot is that there's no mechanism for forgiveness right now in the predominant mainstream culture. Like, are you canceled forever? What are you canceled for? Are you canceled for a bad date? Is it only if you've been found guilty? Does it matter if it's the law? Is it extrajudicial? Is it if it's a sufficient mob on social media? Is it a sufficient mob on social media that's formed of bot armies from hostile foreign players because they want to see us tear ourselves apart? There's no mechanism. And part of the mechanism, and one of the other things about Christianity that I find so beautiful, is that mechanism of, like, you know, that Christ on the cross, it's not like, you know, him dying for your sins means you do whatever you want. It means you're always trying to aspire for something that you can't ever reach. I mean, in some ways, the perfect compression of the Gospels for me is that thing of, like, the most unjust possible thing happening to the least deserving person. It's incredible. But part of what it does also, which I didn't quite realize initially, is, so if you have original sin, you're never going to be the purest possible thing, and you know that. Then you have someone who died for your sins. But then part of the thing that's so cool with that is that you then have a clearance mechanism to not wallow in guilt and self-loathing and depression, because you have to get up and do it again. And so there's like a clearance, there's like a pressure valve. And I think we're seeing a lot of, like, sort of constipated emotional and psychological states in the culture right now, where people are, like, riddled with guilt and they don't know what to do about it. And, you know, so they project that into becoming, you know, vehement allies for other people who don't want them, whose causes they will overload and crumble beneath them, and they're clamoring to do something about it.
Right.
Or you take too much aggressive care of somebody else and you devour them and their will. Or you get depressed and you think you have no worth because you can't. There's no clearance mechanisms. And one of the things that's amazing in these core foundational texts, and you know, I would say, in some ways, like the Odyssey and the Iliad for me are also sacred texts in a manner of just what the sort of received wisdom that they have. there's mechanisms for all that. There's a roadmap for all of that. And this incredible arrogance that like somehow we can clear ourselves from all these modes of thinking. And because we can define the world on the basis of molecules or atoms or reproducible science, that somehow all these facts, which are endless, will organize themselves into some structure, some narrative structure that we can move along and walk through that will keep us oriented in meaning. There's an aspect of that for me that is increasingly unviable. And it's also worth saying, there's one other thing worth saying, which is a lot of my discovery of this came as I got involved in culture and politics really to solve problems, like in the real world. It wasn't because I love politics. It's not because I want to be a politician. It wasn't something like that. And, you know, a lot of it was, you know, when President Trump was elected for his first term, I was not a fan of his. I was very concerned. I was also very close friends with Jordan going all the way back to college, and I was acutely aware of all the problems that the left had and how horrific it was. And the first thing I asked myself was, what are all the things that liberal culture, quote unquote, liberal, left, progressive, secular, whatever you want to call it, got wrong? What are all the things that we're doing wrong? What are all the ways we came off the mark? And the more that I've gone in to examine it, the more I've had to go down to get to the source. So it's like, oh, like I told you about that one Zoom conversation with the congressman where it's like, oh, the answer isn't to just keep all environmental protection regulations. That's not even stupid. Sorry, but let me go figure out what to do about it. Let's figure out which ones are and aren't. Let's figure out how to pair you with someone smart over here to have a conversation that's a smart version of this. And as you move towards solving issues, you know, part of the realization that I had is I think that in some ways our political proclivity and our personality structures, like my big five personality structure and where I came from, and who I am and my work and my emotional composition all tend liberal, that high trade openness. But in a lot of ways, whichever way we tend, it's almost as a limitation, because for any topic that I've explored sufficiently all the way down, almost 100% of the time where I wind up is a perfect combination. Like it's like a yin yang of conservative and liberal thinking. And it's like very few people, if anyone, comes into the world with that, because we're all balanced in weird ways, whether you think that's God-given or evolutionarily selected. And we come from different families and different moments in the culture and have different influences. But a lot of my regard for the truth of people who disagree with me has come when I've hit contact with reality of a problem I'm trying to solve. And like the number one lesson I've learned from my interventions in the culture is that reality is where ideology goes to die. If you're going to fix a problem and you go in with some intentions, by the time you actually solve something in reality, you're, you know, oh, I need this idea from libertarians. I need this conservative thing. Oh, look, I'm trying to help this community. The only people helping in this community is the Catholic Church in this like red state rural community. There's nobody there that anything works but them. And as you cobble everything together, that contact with reality means that you come up with something that can't, there's no place for ideology in it. Ideology by definition only floats above everything.
Well, look, it's been a fascinating conversation, and I think we've maybe got to the end of our time here, but I want to just ask you a couple of wrap-up questions. What advice do you have for people who are looking to be more aware of the trap of, you know, radicalization online, try to be more aware of foreign interference online, the issue of polarization, but also just the issue of nihilism and the lack of meaning that's out there when it comes to navigating the online space? Is there anything that you could say to people when it comes to being aware of it and noticing it and not falling into that trap? Is there anything there?
I think so much of our culture is geared on self-focus and self-reflection. And you'll notice when you're online, it's like, oh, look, here's an algorithm that gets me and listens to me. I was just talking about, you know, buying that bike, and now here's all the ads for the bike, right? And here's all the, you know, ads featuring women who are maximally attractive to me. And here's all the ideas that feed me. And here's all these things. And we also have a tendency in our discussions of how we process things to be incredibly self-centered now, right? Like therapy culture, like you focus more on yourself and where's your trauma and where's your angst and where's your depression and where's your problem? You know, how is it happening to you? How do you center yourself and your meaning in this? What is your discussion? What is your background? And I think one of the things Jordan has observed is that there's having anxiety and being focused on yourself are virtually indistinguishable. I think a lot of the ways that we approach the world
Really?
are, if you're having trouble and if you're nihilistic, you're looking for something to fix you. You're looking online. And but by the way, of course, I'm not saying that therapy isn't useful or being online isn't useful. Of course, I'm not making an absolute statement, but I'm saying that pendulum has swung very, very far towards self-focus. The more that you can do to put yourself in service of other people, to help in some way, if you're worried about something, find some tiny concrete thing that you can do to help that's actually real in the world, that isn't fundraising and money and tweeting and messaging. And to engage with other people in a way that you're truly helping them is completely essential, to get out of yourself and to start thinking about ways that you can do that. And the other thing I would say is it's very helpful and it's very empowering. If you're feeling really nihilistic and you're feeling like the world's kind of a mess, or you don't have a lot of worth, or you can't find anywhere to get your bearings, there's something incredibly empowering about taking more responsibility in that. Whether it's for your own need to get up and go to work if you don't feel like it, or if you can't get out of bed and you're depressed, but to think, I actually have a responsibility to do this. I'm going to get up. I'm going to show up for my colleagues. I'm going to get up and show up for my friend. It's a responsibility that I have. We have a tendency in this also, in some ways, to move towards, in some ways, more self-indulgence around our anxiety or suicidality or compulsive thoughts or all these things. And I'm not undermining how awful and difficult that can feel. And there's a lot of people right now who are untethered from meaning and who don't have a lot of resources. And I would say, don't be afraid to get out in the world in ways that actually help people. And don't be afraid to have a responsibility, to view the responsibility that you have to get up and to function and to do things and to engage with your friends in your community and with your family or with people, like whatever it is that you have. I'd say those two things, in addition to, I would engage sparingly with social media and articles and op-eds and think pieces and politics and politicians, with anything that you're not willing to actually put real time into, because it's just masturbatory and deadening unless you are going to start to figure out ways. And don't be afraid to start things that are incredibly small in terms of helping. You know, it doesn't matter if once a week you're, you know, drop off a meal to somebody who's homeless, you know, or a can of food. Just something that is concrete in the real world is like a seed that will plant you in reality, and you can move out from there.
I love that you just ended that on the visuals of a seed. I've heard you describe the West as a beautiful cut flower which is now withering, and that now is the time to be planting a new seed, a new flower perhaps. If so, what does that seed look like to you?
So that's me paraphrasing Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who gave a beautiful talk at ARC, the first ARC seminar in London. And she said, Western civilization right now is a beautiful cut flower. It's sitting on a table. And our job, the roots are gone. Our job now is to plant more seeds so that it can continue. I have found a really big focus in, it's, you know, another thing that might be helpful if we're still in the kind of advice lane, which is we really know what things are good for us or not. If I'm doom scrolling, or if I get distracted, or I'm procrastinating, I feel all jangled up. If I'm spending time doing the wrong things or in the wrong places. But there's certain places that you can go to or find, whether that's a church, whether that's a charity that you engage with, whether that's a group of friends, whether it's a place, whether it's a college, that feels like it has this energy that is giving and nourishing and rejuvenating. And I'm finding them more and more. It's very interesting because, you know, in a lot of ways, a lot of my focus has been, how do we change this larger narrative in the world to avoid, you know, cataclysmic problems that are happening? You know, we're down to these foundational issues. You know, we have a war at the birthplace of original sin between Islam and Jews. You know, are machines more intelligent than humans? And what is a man or a woman? Like, we're down to this, like, we've boiled it down to these foundational things. And so my head a lot of times is on a much bigger narrative, but there's a lot of things that are closer to home and that are smaller that are, you can feel when there's a seed, these little seeds growing. And there's a couple of them around. I have a friend who has an artistic company in Los Angeles that just does like beautiful, beautiful work. And it's a small like dance troupe, and everyone I bring there, there's something magical happening there that's alive. There's a small charity in LA that I've been raising money for as best I can, called Harvest Home. And they're kind of a Christian-based group for homeless mothers who are either pregnant or single moms. And they bring them in. There's only 37 of them. So it's very small if you think about the homeless problem in LA, in California, in the country. But when they go through this program, they're brought into this house, like they're sort of cared for. There's different training programs. And when these women move on, 92% of them keep a roof over their head and 100% of them keep custody of their kids. So in one way you could say, well, that's a small scale problem. On the other hand, you can take Solzhenitsyn's approach, which is everything that we do all the time around us matters just as much as everything else. That's another one of these. Ralston College that Stephen Blackwood is founded, the wonderful college with the humanities masters in Savannah, is that every time I go there, it feels like it's this institution of learning that's embedded in the classics that just feels like alive with light and meaning and wonder. And you will find these things if you move around to them, if you're open to them in your world, and move to things that interest you the most. And in the interest, in the thing that's calling, a lot of times you can find a lot of meaning and a lot of rejuvenation in ways that might seem smaller. I mean, the last thing that I'll say is, and this is really important when you're talking about people who are nihilistic, part of it is the world feels so daunting of like, we have a land war in Europe and, there's screaming anti-Semitism, there's misogyny, there's also like everything seems so overwhelming. It's easy to forget when I'm talking about responsibility, every single thing that we do matters. Everything is fractal. I've really come to believe this in ways. It used to be something that was more like a hallmark sentiment to me. But the way that you move through the world and every interaction that you have and every place you choose to put your attention and your focus, which is one of the most powerful things we can do, if there's some little act you can take to help somebody or do something, if there's a tiny effort that you make somewhere, all of these things matter. And those are the things that hold the world together. And I toggle back and forth with these, this is a big wide ranging conversation we're having, between like great man theory, do we need another, Winston Churchill? Do we need someone huge to come along and fix it? Or that Solzhenitsyn response that is everyone lies all the time and the society goes down. But he was dying of cancer in a gulag, and he set his own soul in order, and he took this fearless personal inventory of all the times he did something wrong, and he figured all that out, and he essentially memorized the Gulag Archipelago, and he wrote a book, being one of the most disempowered human beings on the planet, that essentially was the moral argument paired with the geopolitical and economic realities. It was the moral argument that helped shatter the Soviet Union. It's just extraordinary. So never underestimate how much you taking responsibility in small ways in your life and moving to your interests and finding ways to be responsible and help in tiny ways. Never underestimate that. Those are the things that hold the world together.
Absolutely. I can't emphasize Solzhenitsyn enough. It's a life-changing book. And when you also hear the stories that are adjacent to that, the persecution of, let's say, the Christians in the Soviet Union, where these monks were being marched out into the frozen tundra and being sent to their deaths for not refusing to renounce Christianity, for refusing to bow down to the image of Stalin. And they had the choice, and they willingly took their, they took their monk's clothes off, and they just gave the symbol of the cross, and they forgave the person doing it, and they just went to their death. And you just think, this person, not only is this just so alien to the modern mind, but like they have their priorities in order and are not afraid of the thing that is paralyzing the rest of the world. And yet we don't know their name, and they just existed somewhere in Siberia. And they're the most inspirational person I've ever come across, that I just hung my head in shame just to think of all the people I've ever, idolized throughout my teen years and 20s, whether they be famous filmmakers or musicians or whatever. You think, just shame on me. Like, those people are nothing compared to this, this old woman, this old man somewhere in Siberia that just gave the symbol of the cross and just went to his death because he didn't want to compromise on that. It's just remarkable.
It's amazing too that you see it provides you an anchor when you go online and someone's complaining, vehemently that their name is misspelled on a Starbucks cup, and you just think you can see these inversions, right? Is the villain made hero? Are we promulgating imagined slights into the biggest thing that is possibly imaginable for our own self-gain versus what you're describing? That's a beautiful story. And look, I mean, they're not afraid of what everyone else is afraid of. They're afraid of something else even more.
The unseen enemy, the unseen warfare, and it's like they're all carrying their crosses, and it's like, how much better would things, I don't want to get too dreamy with this, but it does seem like we've lost the knowledge of how to carry our cross. And I think this is what we're seeing. I think some of the things we're now worried about and we're seeing in the West is downstream from something much greater in the narratives. And I think this is, again, to call up Solzhenitsyn again. He said this, like, someone asked him, like, how would you define all the ills that went wrong in the 20th century? And he says, like, there's no other simple way of saying it than just the idea of that man has forgotten God. And he delivered a great Templeton address to that. And whether you're a secular or the atheist or whatever, I think it's worth exploring this, even if some of it might seem foreign at first, because there's something to this. And when you mentioned earlier that there's, basically uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, you'll know that they'll have, 5 fingers and whatever else, and they'll have a belief system about creation and the transcendent and the unseen. And what we're experimenting with over the last however many years in the West is basically one of the first civilizations that is trying to do away with that. And what are we left with? And could this be as a result of us trying to do away with that? And I think someone like Solzhenitsyn would say, yes, that is the result of doing away with God, and certainly Nietzsche predicted that. So there's a lot to be discussed there, and I don't know if you had any final thoughts on that before I ask you the last question.
No, go ahead.
Where can people follow you online? Where can people find your work? What would be the best first book for people to buy of yours and read if they're not familiar with your writing so far, if they're new to you as an author? Where should they start, and where should they follow you?
Well, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter primarily. I have Blue Sky as well, and YouTube. I'm probably the most active on Twitter for this kind of stuff, but I have big following and posting about the books and the writing. You can also go to my website, which is gregghurwitz.net, and sign up for my newsletter. And for books, I would definitely say read Nemesis. Nemesis is the newest Orphan X book. You can start there. It touches on a lot of the themes that we're discussing. I mean, I wrote a lot of Nemesis coming out of that time I spent in Exodus and kind of reconfiguring a lot of things I was thinking about creatively. Yep. And that's so I would say that's the book to get for sure.
Awesome. Well, I want to encourage everyone to go get Nemesis and to follow you, because I think you're at the heart of something really important right now, and I just admire your work, and I think what you're doing is super important. So thank you for coming on the show. I'd love to have you on again, and until next time, Godspeed.
Thanks, man. Nice talking with you.